Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this event that we have been so much looking forward to ever since David Shambaugh spent much of an academic year with us, writing much of this remarkable and important book, Breaking the Engagement, How China Won and Lost America. I'm Larry Diamond. I'm a senior fellow here at the Hoover Institution, and I will moderate this discussion with David Shambaugh after he gives his opening remarks, and with Elizabeth Economy. So let me introduce them both. David Shambaugh is an internationally recognized scholar and award-winning author on contemporary China and the international relations of China. I think he's authored or edited 35 books, so he's been a busy guy over the last half century or so, or I guess it's more like 40 years as a scholar, formally. This is an extremely important culmination of a lot of that career. He's been both an active public intellectual and a professor and leading contributor to China studies and US-China policy since he got his PhD under our mutually beloved late friend and colleague. I can say mutually for Liz and David and Jean and Andy, and in a little bit more distance and less in the realm of China studies myself, the late great Michael Oxenberg. He then went on to become a reader in Chinese politics at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, where he served as editor for 5 years of the leading journal in the field, China Quarterly, and then returned to his alma mater, George Washington University, undergraduate alma mater, to become the Gaston Sigur Professor of Asian Studies. As he explains in this fascinating autobiographical essay that opens the book, Professor Shambaugh visited China at least once a year for professional purposes for 36 years, from 1979 to 2015. And in that year, he published a little essay in the Wall Street Journal, whose misleading title, as he explains, caused him to be largely banned from substantive engagement in China for 9 years. And during those 36 years, when he was traveling to Beijing and other parts of China, he engaged party, government, and military officials at multiple levels, traveled to 27 of China's 31 provinces, lectured in Chinese and English to multiple audiences, and became, in China, I think, one of the best known American scholars of China and of the US-China relationship. During that period, he also lived off and on in China for a total of 5 years. Given this deep engagement with China, and over the same roughly half century with the American policy establishment on China, David Shambaugh was almost uniquely positioned to write this book, Breaking the Engagement, How China Won and Lost America. Following David's remarks, we will hear from and have joining the conversation our colleague at the Hoover Institution, Elizabeth Economy, who's the Hargrove Senior Fellow and co-director of the program on US, China, and the World here at the Hoover Institution. Elizabeth Economy. From 2021 to 2023, I think most of you know, she took leave from the Hoover Institution to serve as the senior advisor for China at the US Secretary of Commerce. Before joining Hoover, she was the C.V. Starr Senior Fellow and Director of Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is the author of 4 books on China, including most recently, The World According to China, and the editor of 2 volumes, and she's now hard at work on her next book, She serves on the boards of the National Endowment for Democracy and the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and is a member of the Aspen Strategy Group and the Council on Foreign Relations. So I'm now going to want to sit down so I can see your slideshow as well as your presence in full form. David, the floor is yours, and then we'll resume in conversation. And then you all will get a chance to, and if you wish, Liz Economy.
Well, thank you very much, Larry, for the very generous introduction and the opportunity to present my brand new book here at Hoover today, and to thank everybody who came in person, and welcome everyone who's watching online and on C-SPAN. Book TV is here today, so there are multiple audiences, but thanks everybody for coming. So I am indeed delighted to be back at Hoover to have this opportunity to launch my new book today. It was exactly 1 year ago. I was nearing the end of a truly productive half year here as a distinguished visiting fellow during sabbatical from my home institution at George Washington University. And I was literally, I was glued to my desk across the courtyard here in the Herbert Hoover Memorial Building, HHMB as it's commonly known around here, finishing the last chapter in the appendix of the book. It was 1 year ago. Here we are, fast forward 365 days, and it exists. Sort of all authors kind of marvel when they receive the physical product. You know, it's hard to imagine it's gone from on screen to physical product in a year, but seems like yesterday. But that period here at Hoover was tremendously stimulating and productive period for me, and I'm deeply grateful to Hoover and to the director, Condoleezza Rice, for making it possible. So it's great to be back. Okay. So my new book has been stimulated by two principal puzzles. One more historical, one more contemporary. First, in my many years of studying and teaching the history of U.S.-China relations, and I have an annual graduate seminar just finished a few weeks ago. Over the years, I've grappled with trying to understand the deep kind of underlying drivers of this relationship, this fluctuant relationship. This relationship has been anything but steady and consistent. It fluctuates repetitively back and forth between amity and enmity, back to amity, then to enmity, and the cycle continues in seemingly endlessly in what the late and I feel great China historian Warren Cohen, who just sadly passed away 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we miss, but he was a tremendous colleague. He referred to this repetitive fluctuant dynamic as the love-hate cycle in the U.S.-China relationship. And he traced it back many, many decades. So I've puzzled about that phenomenon, and the first chapter of the book is called Elusive Equilibrium. In fact, that sort of sets out the historical puzzle. What causes these two countries, not just in the communist period, but in the Republican period and the imperial Chinese period. So this is a historical trend. The second more recent and contemporary puzzle that animates the book or stimulates me is why, after 4 decades of engagement, American engagement with China, in which the American and Chinese governments and societies became deeply entwined with one another, and bilateral cooperation was predominantly the norm, despite occasional frictions and periodic crises, including on June 4th, today is June 4th, June 4th, 1989, but why, over the past decade, has the engagement given way to comprehensive competition where frictions and systemic disengagement have become the overriding character of the relationship. So that's the sort of more contemporary puzzle. How is it that China's previously positive image amongst the American public has taken a nosedive since 2012 or thereabouts to today, whereby last year in 2024, more than 80%, as you can see from this first slide, 80% of the American public view China unfavorably, more than 80%, 83, I think. Moreover, the Pew data, Pew Research Center, and they found also last year that 42% now of the American public view China as an enemy. 50% see it as a competitor, while only 6% see China as a partner. So the answer to these puzzles and the basic argument of my book is that over 4 decades, from the 1980s through the 2010s, China won over America, proverbially, through its generally reformist domestic policies and foreign policies, which coincided with America's premises and expectations, I should say, of America's engagement strategy towards China. So the United States expectations of China is the independent variable in this story. China's behavior is the dependent variable. I'll say more in a moment about what these American expectations were. But in short, the argument is that when China's policies and behavior conformed with American expectations, the two could cooperate and generally had non-conflictual relations. But when China did not conform to American expectations, frictions followed. Moreover, ironically, I found in the research, did not expect to find, but once I began digging, I found that the deeper the engagement and the presence of each country in the other's society, the other's country, the deeper the suspicions and the greater the frictions that emerge. So this is counterintuitive and an irony, real irony, because engagement was premised on the liberal assumption that the deeper and broader each side's presence in and interactions with the other, the greater the cooperation and the stronger the relationship would be. All right. So quite to the contrary, I found. Beginning around 2010, a wide variety of American actors began to encounter considerably increased obstacles to their work in China. Non-governmental organizations, journalists, US companies, foundations, universities, and educational exchange organizations, US Embassy and its consulates, and many other American actors. It's never been easy for any of these actors to work in China. But there was 2010, in retrospect, was a turning point, and after which all began to encounter increased impediments and obstacles to their normal work in the country. So I have my theories about why 2010 was a turning point. It was more broadly, I think, in China's own internal and external trajectory. Because after that time, as I say, a variety of foreign, not just American actors, began to experience increased impediments, controls, and obstacles to their work, normal work. I personally experienced it too. I was a senior Fulbright scholar at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences Institute of World Economics and Politics that year, trying to research my book, China Goes Global. But the Chinese Academy did very little to help facilitate that research. So it was a kind of harbinger of things to come in the academic domain. So that was a turning point, 2010. But then in 2012, Xi Jinping came to power. And over the last 13 years, these trends and obstacles have only dramatically increased, domestically and externally, with what international China specialists refer to as China's, quote, assertiveness and, quote, wolf warrior public diplomacy. Everything in China has become increasingly securitized. Anquanhua in Chinese over the past decade. And this securitization has impacted a wide variety of American and other foreign actors inside of China. National security, 国家安全, has become the #1 national priority of Xi Jinping himself, of the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese government, and has overtaken development as the primary goal of the Chinese state. And Xi Jinping has laid out what he calls the the comprehensive concept of security, which has no fewer than 22 categories, including several sub-elements within each category of national security. So the Chinese side has definitely securitized the US-China relationship. Moreover, beginning about a decade ago, China stepped up its own influence and interference activities in this society against the United States and in the United States and other societies, primarily in Europe, but Asia, elsewhere. And these interference and influence activities began to negatively impact American society and actors and violate American laws, impacted American states, universities, civil society, media, and our national security. Now, I say China stepped up these interference activities because such influence and interference activities have been long present as part of their united front and their intelligence espionage activities inside the United States. But around in the mid-2010s, China's intelligence, media, and united front organs have all expanded their presence and malign influence activities inside the US. And there's no better source on this than, in fact, the 2018 Hoover Task Force report that Larry Diamond co-led and Liz Economy and I were part of, entitled Chinese Influence and American Interest. That was, gosh, that was 7 years ago, but that was really the first serious investigation of this subject. Now it's considered rather commonplace, unfortunately. So the American government, as a consequence, has also securitized the relationship. Mutual securitization has definitely contributed to the downward trajectory of the relationship, I argue, over the last 10 years. Both sides have done it. Both sides have some responsibility. Okay, so over the past decade, as a result of this, I argue China has progressively lost America. They won it over in the previous decades through their own reformist policies, which conformed with our expectations. But over the last 10 years, their policies and behavior have diverged from the American expectations. So they've lost America. And the actual interests of different American actors, which I collectively call the engagement coalition. Engagement was not just a policy, it was a broad gauge series, broad coalition in our society and in our national government and amongst our states bought into this grand strategy of engagement. There was something in it for everyone. In fact, the elasticity, you might say, of the engagement strategy was its beauty. And no foreign policy in the United States can be sustained without domestic buy-in from different constituencies. So that's what sustained engagement for three, 4 decades. But since over the last decade, as I say, Xi Jinping has, make no mistake, it's Xi Jinping who has broken the engagement. The Chinese side has broken the engagement, this book argues. And that argument echoes Susan Shirk's own recent book, Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise. So Susan and I are analyzing the same phenomenon and coming out pretty much in the same place. So the engagement strategy had run its course. The engagement coalition had crumbled and has been replaced over the past decade by a new strategy of what I describe in the book as comprehensive competition and a new counter-China coalition has replaced the engagement coalition. It's a broad coalition. Many actors are part of the new coalition as they were the old one. Okay, now you might ask, what was the strategy and what were the policies of engagement intended to achieve in the first place? You may rightfully ask. Fair question. And the book goes, well, let me just give you a quick summary of it. In my view, there are 4 elements that comprise the strategy and content of engagement and 7 tactics. 4 elements and 7 tactics. Very Chinese, right? The 7个战略和4个策略. So here we go with the 4 strategies. U.S. engagement strategy sought to, in my view, modernize China economically and technologically, liberalize China politically and socially. Notice I did not say democratize. I said liberalize. Difference. To integrate and socialize China internationally into the post-World War II international liberal order. And fourthly, to exchange people in multiple professions in both societies, what I call in the book engagement as process. So to repeat, to modernize, liberalize, socialize, and exchange with China. Those are the 4 core elements, as I see it, of goals of engagement. So then what were the tactics? How do you implement this strategy? Well, this slide, if you can read it, briefly. First is government-to-government institutionalization, which you mentioned Mike Oxenberg in your introduction, Larry. Mike was my professor. He was our dear friend and colleague. He was also my boss on the National Security Council, 1977-78, when I worked there, in the immediate run-up to normalization. When he was the architect of normalization for President Carter and Dr. Brzezinski in the US, I would argue. Anyway, one of his strategies was what he called marrying bureaucracies together and turning the negative adversarial bureaucratic missions from the Cold War into more positive cooperative bureaucratic missions between every department and every ministry in the Chinese and the American government. So that's the first tactic. Second tactic, to build society-to-society ties at the subnational level. In a variety of ways. Third, create civil society in China. Fourth, to invest in and trade with China so as to contribute to the marketization of the Chinese economy and to break down, if not dismantle, the socialist planned economy. Fifth tactic, to improve China's domestic governance and professional, what's referred to as capacity building, organizationally, behaviorally. Sixth, building the rule of law. What rule of law? Law based on Western legal premises. And lastly, not unimportantly, educating Chinese students so that they could return to their homeland to contribute to the modernization of China and to be agents of change, liberal, political, and social change. Yes, we wanted to train them in whatever specialty they came here to study, but there was an assumption and a hope, at least, that they would also go back based on modernization theory. A lot of these tactics and the strategy itself grow out of modernization theory. That these students would be agents of change. Okay, so those are the, in short, there is no classified master document in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. that lays out the engagement strategy. There's indeed an enormous debate about what the engagement strategy was. And chapter 1 of the book explores that debate. There are some people in the audience who have been participants in that debate. But so there's each administration came along, had their own internal classified documents. But I think if you read them all, and I trace in the book all these administrations through, these were the core elements of the strategy and the tactics. So one can certainly question, therefore, if these American assumptions and goals of engagement were misplaced or not. But I do think whether they were or not, they're empirical facts. And they have had much to do with how the two countries have interacted. Now, the critics of engagement, retrospectively, would argue, modernize China? Why? You're creating a peer competitor. Liberalize China? Good luck. You failed, or we've failed, because of the resilience and the strength of the Chinese Communist Party. Socialize China internationally? Partially successful, I would argue, but increasingly seen as a failure as China is acting in many more illiberal and revisionist ways. And lastly, exchanges with China, critics would argue, hugely asymmetrical. There has been little reciprocity over the decades between the two sides. The Chinese have gained substantially more from exchanges than have Americans. So that's the kind of critics' arguments against the engagement strategy in retrospect. Okay, so in short, what's happened here? American liberalism has run into Chinese Leninism. That is, and the Chinese have stubbornly resisted American attempts to change it. Now, one can certainly understand why, if you look at it from the perspective of the CCP and the Chinese side, because they see this strategy and these tactics as subversive to their political system and their power and their control. Ever since, in fact, 1955 and John Foster Dulles' famous testimony in front of Congress about peaceful evolution, 和平演变. John, at that time, Mao and the Chinese Communists said, oh, that's what these Americans are out to do to us, peacefully evolve us. That's 1955, folks. Well, so that's been their default assumption about us ever since. And guess what? They're right. That's exactly what we've been trying to do. But not successfully. Okay, so at times, you know, the Chinese, if this was their default assumption, I argue, but the Chinese communists sublimated their fears of peaceful evolution because they had larger benefits to be gained from the relationship. But it's always been under the surface and popping up. So they have taken, by taking advantage of America's, you know, perhaps naive largesse, China has milked engagement for its own benefit. Many American constituencies all bought into the strategy. As I say, this was the beauty of the strategy. It was elastic. It gave farmers and different parts of our society a stake. They became stakeholders in the coalition. So this is how China won America, and many other European, Asian, and other nations have all accepted this strategic policy logic, and they pursued their own versions of engagement with China. Okay, so, but I think, so that's a kind of summary of the core argument of the book. But to fully understand the rise and fall of the engagement strategy, oops, really requires, I believe, recognizing the long-standing and deeply embedded paternalistic missionary impulse, which was actually Warren Cohen's term originally, to the missionary impulse to mold and shape China that lies at the core of the American approach to China over several centuries. Indeed, American attempts to shape, mold, and change China far predate President Nixon's opening. They date back to the 1800s, in fact. And the first two American ambassadors to China. On the left, you have Anson Burlingame, after whom Burlingame, California, just north of here, is named, in case you local residents didn't know. He was the first American ambassador, minister, they call it, to China. And subsequently, J. Ross Brown, who succeeded him. Now, Burlingame and Brown both sought to move the Qing dynasty leaders in more modern and liberal directions. Indeed, the Qing dynasty leaders wanted to move in more modern and liberal directions. But interestingly, these two gentlemen also epitomized two alternative approaches to doing so. Burlingame advocated for what he called the cooperative policy, and what might be described as patient paternalism to work with Chinese reformers in a cooperative fashion. By contrast, Ambassador Brown favored a coercive policy to pressure China to undertake reforms. Burlingame indulged the Chinese, even learning the language, and the Qing court, they loved him. They liked him so much that they designated him to represent all foreign emissaries to the court at the time. By contrast, Brown was condescending. He advocated tough diplomatic pressure, moral condemnation, and the threat of force. So why do I bring these two early emissaries up? Because they're radically different approaches, one to accommodate the Chinese, the other to pressure the Chinese, precisely encapsulate the twin alternative approaches that Americans have pursued vis-a-vis China over the subsequent 150 years. Despite the very different tactical approaches, cooperative versus coercive, their strategic goals remain the same: to change China. This is in American DNA, and it constitutes a core element of the American approach to China over time, and is, I think, the core tension in the relationship. So even during the pre-engagement era, during the Cold War, height of the Cold War, during the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations, there were those who advocated for relaxing containment and opening ties to China. Let me digress here for a second concerning President Kennedy. 8 days prior to his tragic assassination on November 14th, 1963, in what turned out to be his last press conference, in response to a journalist's question concerning the possibility of trade with China, Kennedy suddenly declared to the assembled, you can see, the assembled journalists, you can read for yourselves, quote, "We are not planning on trade with Red China," as it was then known, "in view of the policy that Red China pursues. But if the Red Chinese indicate a desire to live at peace with the United States and with other countries surrounding it, then quite obviously the United States would reappraise its policies." Last sentence, "We are not wedded to a policy of hostility to Red China," unquote. 1963, ladies and gentlemen. Now, at the height of containment. But there is considerable evidence, which I describe in chapter 3, that Kennedy was inching towards offering some kind of olive branches, excuse me, and a possible opening to Beijing when he was tragically assassinated. Most notable olive branch was a major speech that he had authorized Assistant Secretary of State Roger Hilsman to give at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. The draft had been fully written, and Kennedy unfortunately was assassinated. So there was a question: does Hilsman go ahead with a speech? Well, the new Johnson administration authorized that he should go ahead with a speech, and he gave it. And it's well worth rereading, everybody, if you're interested. Okay, so there were advocates inside the US government at the time. But I also recount in that chapter that there were kind of activist efforts in the American society who were agitating for, or advocating, I should say, advocating for some sort of relationship with communist China. The American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, the UN Association of the United States, League of Women Voters, the American Chamber of Commerce, and several notable academics. Notably Robert Scalapino, John King Fairbank, Alexander Eckstein, Doak Barnett, Ellen Whiting, Lucian Pye, and others were all instrumental. And in the 60s, we're talking about now here, in advocating for some olive branches, some opening to China. So there was grassroots mobilization. And this resulted in the formation of 3 important non-governmental bodies: that were created by these individuals I just named at the time: the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China, and the National Council on U.S.-China Trade, now called the U.S.-China Business Council. These three institutions were critical in the 1970s in the lead up to normalization, and then they remained critical in the post-normalization period. So President Nixon's bold gambit to Beijing in 1971-72 was in fact pushing on an increasingly open door in US society. Even Nixon premised his opening to China on the notion of changing China. There's a quote from his article in 1967 in Foreign Affairs: "The world cannot be safe until China changes. Thus, our aim, to the extent that we can influence events, should be to induce change," unquote. That's President Nixon. So you get the through theme of this book: to change China. Okay, with that thematic context, let me, and an eye on the clock, let me really briefly discuss how the book unfolds. There, you can digest that. You can look at that slide while I say a few words about it. I'm not going to go into all of it, but this is the table of contents. I've already essentially discussed chapters 1 through 4. The preface discusses my own personal experience of living through and participating in the engagement and the disengagement process. My own life and career has very much personified this broader country-to-country story that I tell in the book. There may also be some surprises for readers, like how I might have saved President Reagan's life from a possible assassination attempt during his state visit to China in 1984. Let me just tease you with that. But there's a real story there, real empirical story. Chapter 4 of the book, maybe an incentive to go to the back and buy a copy at the end, but the entire second half of the book examines the period from 2017 to today. First half is more historical, second half more recent, the last decade. Chapter 5 examines the first Trump and Biden administrations and how engagement turned to a policy of comprehensive disengagement and strategic competition. Chapter 6 looks at what I call inside the Beltway, at how 3 key governmental actors have abandoned engagement and have joined the counter-China coalition: executive branch departments, the Congress, and the national security community, which is made up of the US military and the intelligence and counterintelligence communities. So that's chapter 6, the Washington part of the story. Chapter 7 is outside the Beltway, outside of Washington part of the story. Very long chapter, 20,000 word long chapter, because it's a big country with a lot of actors who are involved in engagement. So I look at all these non-governmental actors in the American body politique, beginning with and notably with a discussion of the MAGA movement, how China is viewed by that constituency. And then it proceeds through 4 key actors: American NGOs, American universities, American business community, and American states. And I show in detail in each case how each has been negatively impacted by and alienated from China, hence losing America. So the Chinese alienated the national government in Washington, and they've alienated the society outside of Washington. So time doesn't suffice to go into these 2 chapters and the various actors, but I'd be happy to discuss any of them you may like in the question and answer period. Chapter 8, quickly, is about what I call the great American-China policy debate of recent years, which is still ongoing. It's not over. There's an earlier, in chapter 1, I talk about the did engagement fail debate, which was more finite from 2017 to 19. But this chapter 8 is about the post-2018 to the present debate about American-China policy. Where should it go? Well, needless to say, Americans are not of one view. And I try to parse the debate and the debaters by putting them into one of 5 schools of thought. Let me briefly describe them for you. Yeah, there they are. First is what I call the stealthy rival school. The idea for them is that China has a secret grand strategy to undermine, overtake, and replace the United States as the world's principal power. For this school, all the dots of China's domestic and global behavior connect, and they point to a regime doing its best to undermine the United States and the global liberal order. That's the first school. Second school I distinguish is what I call the comprehensive competition school, which is a loose coalition of those who argue that the US is locked into a series of essentially zero-sum competitive relationships in different functional spheres: security, diplomacy, commerce, technology and innovation, higher education, domestic politics and ideology, global governance, and other areas, and that the United States should go on the offense in each of these spheres, push back against and resist China while advancing American national interests. This is the comprehensive competition school. Third school I identify as what I call the re-engagement school. Those who argue that the United States simply needs to get back to the old engagement strategy. They should never have abandoned it under Trump and Biden in the first place. The old strategy still serves the US well, that China is not an adversary or even a competitor of the United States, and the US needs to kind of take a deep breath, re-extend the hand to Beijing and re-engage with the Chinese side. That's the re-engagement school. Then there's a group I call the strategic empathy school, which is a slight variant on the re-engagement school, but this is those who think that China is only reacting to assertive and aggressive American actions, and that the US needs to better understand China's insecurities, not provoke them, do not demonize them, but rather be strategically empathetic. So that's school number 4. And then lastly, there's what I call the managed competition school, who believe and argue that competing against China and protecting American national interests must be pursued, and assertively so. However, at the same time, they argue that they believe that a series of guardrails, buffers, off-ramps, and dialogue mechanisms are necessary, some resurrected from Cold War 1.0 during the détente phase with the Soviet Union. Look back in the toolbox from that period and see there are some useful guardrails, dialogue mechanisms, other things that can be reactivated, you might say, need to be constructed in order to manage the competition so that a full-blown adversarial relationship or war do not result. That's the 5th school. Okay, final chapter offers my own prescriptions for the future of, I decided to put my own cards on the table and let the reader know, where does Shambaugh stand? Okay, well, I lay it out in chapter 9, and for a future American-China policy, strategy and policies. And I proceed from my premises that the US-China relationship is, in my view, now characterized indefinite, comprehensive, competitive rivalry, which makes for a very bad acronym, ICHR or something, indefinite, comprehensive, competitive rivalry. Intrinsically competitive, comprehensive in scope, a classic great power rivalry, and indefinite in temporal nature. It will be with us, folks, for a very long time. So that's how I see the relationship. As such, my own preference is the United States should go on the offense in assertively competing with China in various spheres, but to manage the competition as to establish a relationship of what I call competitive coexistence. I actually have intellectual property rights on that term. I used it first in an article 10 years ago. It's now kind of seeped its way into common parlance, but competitive coexistence. So my policy is assertive competition and competitive coexistence. And it has a number of elements which, Larry, we can talk about this afterwards if you like. Maybe we should, just for the sake of time. If people are interested, for me to unpack my assertive competition, competitive coexistence strategy, I'd be happy to do so. So let me just wrap up and finish. Finally, there is an appendix in the book, really a separate chapter, that flips the script, you might say, and examines how China's America Watchers, subject about which I wrote my PhD dissertation, back many decades ago at the University of Michigan. So I've been watching their watchers for a long time. So, and this is what I was doing across the way last year, trawling through it, taking a detailed trawl through an unprecedented set of domestic Chinese internal publications, many of which are Neibu, about their understanding of the engagement policy in the first place, and their own explanations to each other about why the Americans, why the relationship has deteriorated, and why the engagement policy has fallen apart on the American side. And I found, in fact, that these so-called America watchers or America specialists, you can watch without being a specialist, I found an abysmal and shocking intelligence failure on the part of these individuals who were supposedly the best China had. They totally failed to anticipate and understand the significant shifts occurring in American society, government, and thinking about China during the Obama years, prior to the shift in policy under Trump. Okay, so it asks the basic question in this appendix: has there been a "who lost America" debate in China? And if so, or if not, why not? Does the Chinese side, in fact, believe that China bears any responsibility for the profound shift in American attitudes and policies and the disintegration of engagement? Well, the short answer, in short, is a resounding no. China, these America watchers and the people who participate in this discourse in China accept zero blame for the deterioration of the relationship over the last decade. And they believe, and there has been no "who lost America" debate, therefore. As far as they're concerned, the deterioration of the relationship over the last 8 to 10 years is 100% the fault of the American side. So I think this book it would behoove the Chinese side to read this book to better understand the profound changes in American policies and perspectives and China's own agency and role therein. But I'm hardly anticipating a Chinese translation of the book. But anyway, that's a summary of the book. Hopefully it gives you incentive to perhaps order or buy a copy. Christmas is not that far away. Makes a great gift for your loved ones. But first, let me please invite my great colleague and good friend, Elizabeth Economy. Liz is one of the few people, maybe 3 people, who've actually read the manuscript, and I welcome Liz's views about it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you for that stirring overview of the book and the intellectual and analytical challenges you posed. And we'll turn to Elizabeth Economy now to offer some reflections. We'll have a bit of conversation, and then we'll turn to our colleagues in the audience.
Great, thanks so much, Larry and David. Thank you. Let me just begin by putting everyone's mind at ease. David has, in fact, written a great book. If it wasn't evident by his terrific presentation, I can assure you the book is well worth purchasing. And I do want to point out, because he just told me this yesterday, that his wife helped design this really beautiful cover, so which I commented on. Anyway, why do I say David's written a great book? I think it's analytically rigorous. He offers a fresh perspective and a distinctive argument, and it is really engagingly written. And that, in this day and age, is not that easy to do. We are flooded by noise and news and commentary, opinion on China and on the US-China competition. Some of it is informed and some of it is not so informed, as David points out in a later chapter of the book. But it's easy, I think, to lose yourself in the day-to-day press of events and not expend the time and energy to ground yourself in real scholarship. But that is what David has done, and he's cut through the noise and really produced a deeply researched study that is grounded in facts and informal analysis. I think the book is both of the moment in the sense that it is relevant to policymakers and business leaders and really anybody who wants to understand where this relationship is today and how we got here. And it's also a contribution and, additive, truly additive, I think, to the serious literature and scholarship on China. The book is actually, I would argue, 2 books in one. And I think some of that came through in David's presentation. But the first part, or first book of, in some sense, is really a very richly detailed history of the US approach to China. And I think, he talked about the deep roots of the sort of missionary impulse in the United States to change China. And then the ongoing battle between the containment and the engagement narratives. Other books certainly have talked about this history, have done beautiful jobs. Warren Cohen, John Pomfret's book, The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom, also a terrific book that deals with the history of this relationship. But what David does differently is really elevate, I think, and offer a lot of examples, both in terms of quotations, but also sort of historical moments that really elevate the continuities throughout history in terms of the US approach. And he does that actually both on the US and the Chinese side. I think it didn't come through as clearly maybe in the presentation that the book is more equally weighted in terms of the discussions. It's not simply the US approach, but there's a lot about how the Chinese respond at each point to what the United States is trying to do. As I read the book, I had the sense of a dance, actually, between the United States and China, and a dance in which the United States is most often leading, with China following, and at some points the two are perfectly in sync, but at other times the United States comes on too strong and China pushes back, and then the US feels rejected, And this, in some respect, I think describes what David calls this oscillating pattern of engagement, disillusionment, and then re-engagement. Interestingly, David, and I was, I thought it was funny at the very end how you talked about the appendix and the views of Chinese scholars and how you thought that it probably wouldn't resonate, your book wouldn't resonate. But I had a different opinion, and maybe I found the one Chinese scholar and quotation that actually I think if you superimposed it on your book would fit perfectly. And that's a quotation by Wang Jise from an interview that he did, I think it was in 2018 in the Financial Times. And I'm just going to read it to you, and you can tell me later whether you agree or not. But here's what he says. For over 200 years, the US has never changed its strategic goal for its relationship with China: free flow of goods and capital and free flow of information and values. Chinese have always had reservations or imposed boycotts to oppose these two goals. We should criticize and have reason to criticize the United States, but we should realize China's own actions have changed Sino-US relations and US perceptions of China. Here he's speaking about the Xi Jinping period. If we are looking for the cause, it was the change in China's policy that led to adjustments in US policy. US policy has changed because China changed. So I offer that up as one counterpoint, I think, to otherwise, I think a really fascinating last chapter / appendix where you talk about Chinese views. Then the second part of your book, as you described, is really just a terrific exposition of all the actors and interests and debates that are shaping US policy, how the Chinese respond, and then that sort of disillusionment that follows. So that also has that element of a dance. And then finally, I think what makes this book, so distinctive and special is really the storytelling. And you do offer a lot of personal observations from, a lifetime of engagement in the best sense, your experiences, both in terms of how it affected you, but also your contributions to that process as a student, as a scholar, and as somebody involved in the policy world. And for those of you that know David, I can assure you that his tendency not to mince words is very present in this book as well. And so there are a number of parts that actually made me laugh aloud, where you're sort of critical about various ideas and some think tanks and other things. So anyway, it's a personal account that I think really elevates the book. I'm left, I think, with a couple of questions, and I'll just put them out there, and maybe you can address them in the course of the broader conversation. I think I wonder how you see the inevitability of conflict. I think one of the things that struck me initially was that this book was so much more. than, an effort by Graham Allison or, Mearsheimer and that sort of structural realist analysis, right? But there is that inevitability of conflict that both of them see. And it's more than a sort of Matt Pottinger and Rush Doshi ideological conflict makes all of this inevitable. But there are some elements of all of this in your book. And I'm wondering, how do you position yourself, not so much in the schools of thought that you put out there, but in terms of the literature? How do you think of this book positioned against these other kinds of arguments? And then, is this an opportunity now for re-engagement? I know at the end you sort of said this period is going to be long, this sort of, we're in for this long period of conflict and sort of, I think, basically strategic decoupling, although you don't use that term. But when I look at President Trump and I think about this administration, one of the things that's clear is he does not possess this impulse to change China.
Right.
Neither in terms of the liberalization politically of China, nor in terms of bringing China into the system of international institutions, regimes, and norms. And so what does that mean for this relationship, this oscillating pattern? Is this something new? And how would you account for this? And what might this produce in terms of a difference in the US-China relationship moving forward? So I'll end there, but just again, congratulations on a really just terrific book.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much.
Why don't you reply? And then I'd like to ask you both a question.
Okay. So on your second question, Liz, I think that President Trump himself is an aberration from all these previous presidents who did have a transformational vision of China to some extent. But the transformational vision is apparent to me in his administration, particularly Secretary of State Rubio. And he has a long track record and a distinguished one, I would argue. In fact, I would go so far as to say there was no member of Congress on either the House or the Senate who had a better, more granular understanding of China than Marco Rubio. During his service, he gets it. He's done his time. His fingernails in the China garden are dirty. He has worked hard to educate himself. And he's a hawk. Oh, absolutely. But he has a transformative vision. He starts with the political system. But anyway, from what we can tell, and believe me, some of the tactics that he is using are inexcusable and inappropriate. But, I think we see snippets. The Trump administrations, I didn't really want to talk about that because I don't like to speculate about what hasn't already occurred. I'm not a pundit, I'm a scholar. Scholars look backwards in time.
Ouch, David.
Not
Okay,
forward
then.
in time. But no, punditry is, oh, well, what's going to happen tomorrow on the US-China relationship, which is not what you're asking. But I think there are deeper forces than the president himself. And we saw during the first Trump administration, those forces, Matt Pottinger in particular, captured China policy and drove it along with others. And I give Matt great credit, in fact, for what he did. And I discuss his role extensively in the book. So it's too early to say, I think, in this Trump 2.0, where they're going. And you see a kind of tension, you see tensions apparent, but it's too early. Oh, that's your second question. First question had to do, where do I locate myself?
Yeah, in the Graham Allison and Mearsheimer, Rush Doshi, Matt Pottinger, how do you see, in terms of the inevitability of conflict, do you feel that there's inevitability of conflict, and how would you position your book sort of in the literature? What's your model? What's your frame for how you approach this?
Well, if by conflict you mean war, that's a question.
No, I don't mean war necessarily.
Really? Well, I would say conflict is war.
Okay.
As opposed to competition or an adversarial relationship is different. So I don't see an inevitability of war. So I don't agree with Allison's book. I've looked at his 14 cases carefully. This is interesting. So I don't associate with that perspective. And I don't, over time, I have to say, I have come to appreciate and associate myself with Mearsheimer more and more. When he first came out with his Tragedy of Great Powers book, I was in the audience at the Wilson Center. I thought it was the craziest thing I'd ever heard. But I have to say, the more I've listened to him, and I think he was prescient, and I think he's a careful scholar, it's structural argument. The problems in US-China relations are structural. They're ideological, and they're embedded culturally too. So third question is about the third element is agency. To avoid conflict, I am not a determinist. I think that this relationship and both societies have the responsibility, big responsibility, and they have the agency to pull back and to construct, as I say, various mechanisms to manage the competition. So that's where I am in my 5 schools. I'm a member of the Comprehensive Competition School and the Managed Competition School, if you wondered. So I think that there's nothing inevitable about, the competition. It doesn't going to result in conflict, even over Taiwan. There are other actors besides Washington and Beijing there. So I'm not a determinist. And I think if with some, smart people and patience, we can kind of find some more temporary equilibrium before it reverts to the mean. We'll see.
Okay, I'd like to ask you, David, a couple of historical questions, one personal, to which I hope you can give relatively short answers, so I can pose a bigger question to both of you.
Sure.
A lot of people think, and you quote our own director of the Hoover Institution as saying, she thinks, that our policy of engagement was not naive and not a mistake. It was worth a try, right? It was a bet. It was a gamble. It could have gone either way. And this kind of relates to the bigger question I want to ask. If Chinese politics had gone a different way, the bet might have worked out better. It just didn't work out. I don't think that's Mearsheimer's view. I think his view is this was really bloody naive and wrong from the start, and we could have. So is there any distance between you and Mearsheimer in that respect?
Absolutely, yes. And I should have mentioned one other person, Aaron Friedberg. I associate myself with Friedberg's analyses too, more than Mearsheimer. And you're quite right, Larry. So I see agency. I agree with Condi. It was not. This was a good strategy. It was for various reasons, and it simply didn't go the way the American side had anticipated or hoped. It's the Chinese side that, after Xi Jinping, that broke the engagement. So I don't know if that addresses the question.
Yeah,
okay,
it does.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a little bit more personal question that reflects on today. 36 years ago, in the bloody streets of Tiananmen Square was one of the, I think everyone would agree in this room, one of the most important historical events in the history of modern China, and one of the saddest days, if not the saddest day, in maybe the post-cultural revolution history of contemporary China. By the spring of 1989, you'd spent a fair amount of time in China. You'd worked under the late, great Michael Oxenberg, who had worked under Jimmy Carter and Zbig Brzezinski to establish diplomatic relations with China, and had his own, I'd say, very idealistic views about where this could lead, left a deep imprint on many of us. I assume then you were probably watching this on TV while you were a graduate student at SAIS. Just reflect on that and how it affected you personally, and what you were thinking then and how you reflect back on it now.
Well, first, I remember 1 year ago today, sitting in the Stauffer Auditorium with a wonderful session that you organized with Perry Link and others to commemorate this tragic event. So I was, in fact, living in London, England at the time. I was my first position at SOAS. it was my second year there, and
Oh, right.
watching this on television in the UK. And being on television, I had never been on television before that period, but I found myself living in TV studios for 6 weeks, trying to interpret what was going to happen and this and that. But I remember going in the June 5th to the BBC, and it was very just sadness and tragedy. It was my personal emotion. Did I expect that? Well, the troops had been ordered in the previous week, so we knew, that was not the first time. There's I was not surprised by the Leninist response of Deng Xiaoping and using force to suppress these demonstrations, I have to say. And I said so at the time, because I think Deng saw a repeat of the Cultural Revolution and the Red Guards right there in the same place in Tiananmen Square. And that the regime, he saw it in regime survival terms. And it was an politically existential crisis for him and the Chinese Communist Party. And he did not opt for the Zhao Ziyang approach to talk to the students. And he finally opted for the coercive approach. What can one say? But it wasn't a great shock. Many people were shocked. No, I get it. The CCP had been through 4 decades of brutal repression of their society prior, and this wasn't the first time the PLA had killed Chinese. So no, it was not a big surprise to me. I was just, the fact that, that was, as I recall, how I felt. And then I was dispatched 3-4 weeks later by the British Academy to assess I was on the British Academy's exchange board with China, and Chinese Academy of Sciences and Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So I was sent over in 3 weeks to see if what the situation was. Could there be exchanges continued? Well, Academy of Social Sciences was literally occupied by the PLA, and everybody was traumatized. Martial law was in place, and then my wife and I went back and lived there for the subsequent 6 months. That was not a good time. Very interesting, though. The British decided, I came back, I said, well, look, this is not a good environment for exchanges. But they wanted to keep the door open. Very interesting lesson I learned. The British were not as sort of punitive as Americans wanted to be. We wanted to, just slap them down and shame them and castigate them as they deserved. But the British and the Europeans on the continent, interestingly, I learned, because I was very involved with the Commission, European Commission and others, the Europeans had a different reaction to Tiananmen, even though they had the same transformative change China approach. So it's kind of interesting for me as an American to kind of experience Tiananmen in Europe.
Okay, now, a major theme of your book, I think, is the interaction between the internal politics of China and the relationship between China and the United States. And on the second to the last page of your book, I'd say book proper, before the appendix, you write that essentially engagement with a capital E is finished. The strategy and policies around it, maybe some modalities will continue. And then you continue with a very interesting caveat after: the suspicions and frictions in the relationship now run too deep and are so comprehensive that the original premises of engagement are outdated. And then there's a dash and a famous David Shambaugh italicization, and it says, unless the CCP and PRC return to a more reformist and liberal mode of governance, characteristic of the pre-Xi era. So I'd like to ask you both to reflect, first you, David, then Liz, on that interaction and what you see. You complain a lot about Wang Qixi in particular, but also kind of the intellectual and foreign policy establishment in China now. But there are a lot of Chinese we're engaging, I won't go into details, I'll just say that generally, who don't share that view.
Right.
and do not blame the US exclusively or even primarily for the deterioration in the relationship. Right. So think about where China is internally, but more so where it could go depending on one direction or another, and how that might affect the relationship.
Well, good question, Larry. And that's one response is the reason I used the term liberalization and distinguished it from democratization. That was very conscious, because the Americans, there are those who wanted the democratization of China. I don't think that has ever been the American government's real goal. Come on, let's be real about this. But liberalization, civil society, all the elements that we saw appear in the 80s and then after the Tiananmen hiatus, beginning in 1995 under Jiang Zemin, all the way through to 2010. That's when things changed, as I say, 2010. Those were 14 years of creeping liberalization still under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. So as long as the Chinese were liberalizing politically, allowing those sorts of elements of civil society, media, rule of law, then the Americans can work with that regime, with the capital, and engagement with a capital E, which is with the regime. Engagement with a small e, you're quite right, is between the two societies. So these aren't mutually exclusive. I'm glad you posed the question. And I just want to be clear here that we need to have small e engagement. Absolutely. And we need dialogues. We need various connectivity between our two societies. That's the best way to prevent a Graham Allison kind of outcome. So, and many Chinese, you're also quite right, that we know, blame their side. They can't have an open who lost America debate because of their censored system. But I've had personal conversations with, including 1 year ago now in Beijing, with people who blame behind closed doors Xi Jinping for their role in the deterioration of the relationship. So I don't know if that addresses your question.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested in Liz's.
It does, and let's see how Liz will address it.
I mean, I think I agree with David, maybe with the exception of the fact that I think there probably was more of a desire and a belief that China could become a democracy than maybe you give it credit for. I think that modernization theory element of it, what we saw, ultimately what happened with South Korea, what happened with, Taiwan. I think there was a sense that why not China? There were discussions about, not necessarily China enveloping Hong Kong, but maybe Hong Kong would become the model for China. That was a while ago, of course. And I think if you look back to that 2008, 2009, even 2010 period, you saw in China an incredibly vibrant civil society, right? An internet that was alive with protests. You had entrepreneurs and human rights lawyers and scholars meeting in these salons to talk about the future of democracy in China. You had, a big entrepreneur taking a group of other entrepreneurs to Taiwan to show them what a Chinese democracy could look like. I think there was a lot of, and you had, what was it, the count, I think in 2010 was 180,000 protests in China around issues like the environment and pensions and other things. And so to my mind, let me just point out too, you had, individuals beginning to run that were not affiliated with the party running for election, right? And so, at the local level, and now, of course, they ran into some trouble sometimes, but nonetheless, I think overall directionally, I think there was a sense of hope, one might say, that China was on this trajectory. And, for me, it didn't really end until Xi Jinping. And I know you dated to 2010. I think I can still look back and see a lot of dynamism in China's political, in its polity, even at that point. But for me, it was really Xi Jinping, and then the crackdown on from the minute he took power on the newspapers, changing the editorials. So there was no mention of the future of political reform. So, in any case, I'm always of a mind, even today, that, it's really difficult. You know this, I know this, journalists know this, that we don't have the eyes in China that we used to. We don't have the access we used to. It's much harder to see the kind of dissent. You don't have 180,000 protests on the street, 50,000 people marching for the environment. You don't have that now in the same way. But those differences of opinion still exist, right? And so just because what we have access to seems so much more constrained and limited, it doesn't mean that there aren't as many opinions, different opinions inside China as there are in the United States. And I think some of the small scale research that people like Jennifer Pan does here, like on urban middle class Chinese, suggests that there is still a desire, within the middle class of China for, and maybe this is the liberalization as opposed to democracy, but the liberalization of the political system. They want the rule of law, they want the ability to assemble, they want free speech. So all of those things come through in some of these surveys, however limited they are. So I think for sure, it's important to continue to try to engage. It is incredibly difficult, and we can't do it in the way that we used to. We simply can't. The law in 2017 on management of foreign NGOs literally, cut the number of NGOs, foreign NGOs working in China from over 7,000 to under 500. So there's just not that opportunity to engage in the same way, and not the opportunity for business to do business in China in the same way. But again, it doesn't mean that we can't and we shouldn't remain open to it, and we shouldn't foster, cooperation and collaboration wherever we can.
Yes, and one small addendum, if I could, Larry. Students or scholars of Chinese politics are familiar with what's known as the Fang Shou cycle. Fang Shou Zhouqi. Fang is for open, Shou is for closed. And Chinese, this was coined by former UCLA professor Richard Baum, and if I'm not mistaken, and argues that Chinese politics has since Deng has oscillated back and forth between Fang and Shou. Usually, and it's Warren Cohen who actually counted this, if I recall correctly, 7 years of Fang, and then there's a kind of catharsis pullback for usually 1 to 2 years of Shou, followed by 6 or 7 more years of Fang, then 1 or 2 of Shou. And this has been a repetitive process since the 1980s. So unfortunately, right now, we are in year 13 of Shou. China is overdue for a lot of Fang, and there are a lot of people inside the party, not just in the civil society, who, so if Xi Jinping slips in the bathtub or whatever, disappears from the scene tomorrow, I will wager that the party will snap back to Fang.
Interesting. Any questions from our audience? Peter? We'll start with Peter Michelson.
Yeah, thank you. Earlier you mentioned Secretary Rubio and his deep understanding, I think, of the U.S.-China relationship, but you were also referred to tactically, you had some issues with his approach. Does that include, for example, student visas of Chinese students in the United States?
Yes, I think that is very mistaken. Very inappropriate, mistaken, and
that is the ban or cancellation on the visas.
Well, both. I mean, it's unclear what his policy on the visas exactly is. We're going to aggressively enforce. What does that mean? First of all, but no, I believe in our American open door policy in educational exchanges. That's one of our greatest soft power assets as a society. And we have the wherewithal to monitor espionage in our society and on our campuses. So, throwing the baby out with the bathwater with that sort of ban, it's knee-jerk, it's just really unproductive and silly. So I oppose that.
Okay, next.
Thank you, David. I look forward to reading the book. Point I want to make at the beginning, I absolutely agree that the downturn, the difficulties arise from Chinese decisions and actions. And I would date it slightly earlier than 2010, But from a Chinese perspective, it was beginning to look a lot like 1988, 89,
Mhm,
2009.
mhm.
And part of that was the black hand of the United States intervening and exploiting vulnerabilities inherent in connections which come about because of engagement. Where I'd like, a little more comment, and maybe differ, is the elaborateness of the engagement strategy and its tactics and so forth, as you laid, having been one of the people in the room going back to 75. We thought about this not as a special way of dealing with China. This was the way we deal with countries and big objectives: US security, commercial opportunity, and open China to the corrosive and positive effects of interacting with American society. It's the missionary zeal kind of writ large. And the policy was one basically of opening China after we had dealt with, this is the peak of the Cold War, Soviet power at its apex. Didn't do so bad in terms of dealing with the American security dimension to it. Until that time, China had been completely closed to commerce. It was open. US government didn't do much except remove containment-like restrictions, but it said, go ahead. The same for civil society in there. And Oxenberg's build as many ties, contacts as possible as a way of buttressing the relationship so they wouldn't all go bad at the same time. That was a very persuasive argument to us. It scared the bejesus out of the Chinese as one of the ones doing the talking with them. What we thought strengthened the relationship, what we thought stabilized the relationship, they saw as building in levers for the United States to bring about. Absolutely agree with you, this peaceful transformation thing that they have, along with the inevitability of conflict, that really does drive. And the unleashing of the American private sector basically to do its thing, that's the implementation strategy of engagement. So a lot of the other things are post hoc. How do we explain these things that come out? It must have had a purpose. Making money, establishing contacts, working together with 1/7 of mankind to tackle a lot of problems. That was the driver. How do you explain it afterwards? How do you raise funding to do it? You're going to do all of these nice things. The final comment, and it's picked up on Liz, the Taiwan example, South Korea example. It's important to remember they had not happened yet. When engagement, what became known as engagement, was hammered out. We just had Gwangju. The Taiwan had suspended the elections. It's a decade later. So getting the chronology right here when talking about, I know you have it right, but when talking about what was known, what were the priorities of the objectives, and this was fundamentally a Cold War strategy, in my view.
We're running out of time.
And the point you both made is we can't go back to policies developed for a different time when the world is different. China is different. We're different. But thanks for working the issue in this book.
Any reaction?
Not really. I thank you, Tom, for the observations. It just was it John Maynard Keynes who said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? Well, there are some people in this country, the re-engagement school, I call them, who haven't changed their minds, even though the facts have changed. But I agree with you, Tom, about the chronology and so on. So yes, very helpful.
Okay, in the back.
Hi, Oriana.
Oh,
Mastro
Oriana,
here
hi.
at
Oriana
Stanford.
Mastro,
Hi, how's it
thank
going? I have a question about kind of a counterfactual for you. You started your presentation. I read the sections of the book in which you talked about the independent dependent variables being US expectations, then Chinese behavior. I don't have the quote in front of me the way Liz brilliantly had it from Wang Jisi, but there was this quote from Yan Xuetong, who said the problem was U.S. expectations. We could converge our expectations in Chinese behavior if we had accepted very early on that competition was the natural state of our relationship. So I guess what I'm asking you is,
It's launched the Sputnik satellite into space, and all of a sudden the U.S. realized it was in a race that it was losing. Aaron Bateman is an assistant professor of history at George Washington University. In his book, Weapons in Space, tells the story of American offensive weapons in space.
What ends up happening is afterwards, the United States invests much greater resources in science and technology across the board. But one of the things that Eisenhower does is he establishes NASA as the face of the American space program. And so this happens for a variety of reasons, but I think it's really important to know about Eisenhower is Eisenhower did not really care that much about space exploration. But what he was concerned about is that there needed to be some kind of international political regime that viewed satellite reconnaissance, or at the very least overflight from space, as a legitimate activity. And he really worried about having the military as the public face of the American space program. And so what ends up happening between the establishment of NASA in 1958, the establishment of the National Reconnaissance Office in September of 1961, is that you really have the development of three American space programs. You have the civilian program primarily under NASA, you have the military program under the Department of Defense, and then you have the intelligence space program under the National Reconnaissance Office that lives very uncomfortably between the national intelligence community and the Department of Defense. Eisenhower was really concerned that if you have the military as the public face of the American space program, that it's going to give it a much more aggressive militaristic image. And one of the things that he did was he really restrained some of the more, I would say, outlandish aspirations of the military services for all kinds of offensive capabilities in space that also weren't really of great military utility at that time.
The Air Force may have lost space to the civilian NRO, but the Sputnik moment galvanized ballistic missile development in the Air Force. Congress and the President infused the Air Force's ballistic missile program with cash. The budget for the weapons went from $3 million in 1954 to $2.15 billion in 1958. Maybe more importantly, an enterprising Air Force General, Bernard Schriever, focused on process and production, leading to the Atlas missile program and its descendant, the Titan, which sprinted forward technologically as congressional and executive pushes ensured a solid budget allocation. Support no doubt spurred by the Soviet Sputnik moment. Here's General Schriever from a 1992 oral history, recounting how President Eisenhower protected him as he cut through Air Force bureaucracy and kept the ballistic missile program a top budget priority, even in an administration that was fiscally conservative.
General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, he certainly didn't want to spend money on obsolete systems, which in the military sometimes hang on to for far too long. But he certainly understood technology and the importance of it and the importance of introducing it into the inventory of the military at the earliest possible date. And this was such new technology. And for the first time, it really threatened the United States of America. And I mean, it was a real threat. We had never, our shores had never been threatened before and anywhere close to like that. So the funding, while he was bent on a balanced budget, we were given priority funding-wise. And I can say that we didn't get a blank check, but we certainly were funded adequately, and we did achieve our target dates, incidentally.
In just a few short years, Schriever pushed Atlas and Titan past their Army competitors and cemented the Air Force's control over both intercontinental ballistic missiles and the shorter-range, intermediate-range ballistic missiles. This was good news for the Air Force's overall budget, as fears that the Soviets were leading the United States in missile and space development ultimately drove Eisenhower's Scientific Advisory Committee to recommend an increase in IRBMs from 60 to 240 systems, and an increase in ICBMs from 80 to 600. So what's the Army doing during all this Air Force, Navy, missile jousting? The Army started off promisingly with the Redstone Arsenal, which featured the first missile used in an American nuclear test. Additionally, the Army's Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles, the program the Navy abandoned, outperformed the Air Force competitor, the Thor. However, when the Air Force launched an effort to control ballistic missiles, including a remarkable public campaign in the New York Times maligning the Army's missile program, the Army eventually ceded most of these missions and capabilities to the Air Force. The Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles were ultimately fielded by the Air Force and decommissioned shortly after. The one long-range nuclear-capable missile the Army retained control of, the Pershing, survived the Air Force onslaught only because they allowed the Air Force to axe the Mace cruise missile, which the Air Force hated even more than the Army-controlled Pershings. So the Army may not have been doing missiles, but it was fighting a war, and a nasty one at that. Just a few years after World War II, the Korean War broke out.
But there was worse to come. A highly trained and well-equipped North Korean army swarmed across the 38th parallel to attack unprepared South Korean defenders. Caught off guard, they were all but overwhelmed until the United Nations took its historic vote to intervene.
This often overlooked hot war in Asia changed the way the U.S. military thought about its capabilities. In particular, it created space for the military to experiment with unmanned systems. The Army developed anti-tank, anti-personnel, and bounding mines, which they used extensively during the Korean War, often deployed by aircraft. Mines were seen as a necessary and effective tool to combat large wave offensives such as those seen in the Chosin Reservoir, and led to the development of the Claymore mine, an above-ground command-detonated mine that continued to be used all the way into Vietnam. The Korean War also forced both the Air Force and the Navy to develop tactical systems to support the ground fight. After largely ignoring guided bombs after World War II, the need for more accurate combat air support during the Korean War led the Air Force to dust off a radio-controlled bomb designed at the tail end of World War II, the Raison VB-3, and subsequently modified the Tarzan, a 12,000-pound bomb, with Raison's radio guidance. The war also saved cruise missiles from the budget trash heap. Strategic Air Command had abandoned the cruise missile in favor of the ballistic missile, but the less powerful Tactical Air Command continued to invest in cruise missiles, developing and deploying the Matador and Mace nuclear cruise missiles to Europe and Asia, as well as smaller air-launched missiles and decoys. These early cruise missile systems were designed to target air defenses, as well as other conventional military targets that might have otherwise been difficult for manned fighters and bombers to reach. The Korean War cemented their utility and kept the systems a priority for Air Force investment, despite the relative power disparity between Strategic Air Command and Tactical Air Command. Finally, the Korean War also spurred investment in air and surface missiles. In particular, the Navy ship-based Terrier and the Sparrow air missile systems, as well as the Army Nike ground-based missile system, were put on the fast track for development because of the Korean War. The Korean War demonstrated the important role that wars play in weapons trajectory. Wars forced the services to work outside their core identity, and in this case, to invest in tactical unmanned systems with joint missions. As we've seen in this episode, the U.S. had a lot of choices coming out of World War II. New technologies opened the door for remarkable innovation. But those technological choices were made just as much because of the organizational tumult of the new Department of Defense as they were a response to technology itself. We also saw how context mattered, a Sputnik moment, a growing nuclear shadow, and a war on the Korean Peninsula all shaped U.S. investment in unmanned systems. But everything was about to change, because it wouldn't be long before the conflict in Vietnam dominated the evening news and forced a reckoning in the U.S. military, one that would set the stage for the predators and reapers of the early 2000s. Join us in the next episode when we come back to the U.S. military in the midst of a Cold War, fighting an unpopular proxy war in Vietnam and reckoning with a new technology, the computer, and its potential offset implications for modern warfare.
I'm Julia.
And I'm Jackie.
This is the Hand Behind Unmanned podcast. If you liked it, buy the book. It's by Oxford University Press and available on Amazon.
Thanks for listening.
Episode 3, Air-Land Unmanned Battle, Vietnam to the Fall of the Wall.
There's no way to capture the suffering and grief of our own nation from the most divisive conflict since our own Civil War. We embarked on this Vietnam journey with good intentions, I think, but once upon the path, we found ourselves having been misguided. Many of us, myself included, in our private, personal opinions of the rightness of this course, came half-circle around. And perhaps that is our big lesson from Vietnam, the necessity for candor. We, the American people, the world's admired democracy, cannot ever again allow ourselves to be misinformed, manipulated, and misled into disastrous foreign adventures. The government must share with the people the making of policy, the big decisions.
Welcome to The Hand Behind Unmanned, a podcast about how America fights war without human beings, told from the perspective of the human beings making those choices. I'm Jackie Schneider.
And I'm Julia MacDonald. In this podcast, we take you inside weapons budget lines and behind classified program doors to understand not only what unmanned technology the US military bought, but why. For those of you who came for the technology, we hope you'll stay for the people, because this really is a
Warfare, and above all, the human hands at the heart of unmanned technology.
In the last episode, we talked about military service identities and examined how the distinct cultures and interests of the Army, Air Force, and Navy affected the way each one thought about buying and using unmanned technology during the Cold War. In this episode, we're going to delve into the related roles of beliefs, a key factor in explaining how we got the unmanned force of today. Many individuals in the military services and other parts of the defense establishment brought specific beliefs about military technology to the table that often became more important than the details and characteristics of the technology itself. Today, I'm going to focus on one belief that emerged organically in the waning days of Vietnam and shaped a cadre of officers who went on to develop doctrine, plans, and campaigns for the Department of Defense over the following 30 years. This group of individuals brought to unmanned development a deep and ingrained belief that strategic success was tied not only to tactical success, but also to the military's ability to win wars without losing public approval. From this belief came a drive for unmanned technology to protect the U.S. Armed Forces and mitigate the effect of public casualty aversion. Whereas previously unmanned systems, mines, large warhead missiles and bombs, and even kamikaze drones had been designed to create advantages in wars of attrition, these new systems were focused on avoiding, opting into, or getting stuck in those very wars. This would be a remarkably sticky trajectory for unmanned use, in which remotely piloted, large airframes would end up dominating the battlefield. First, what is this casualty aversion belief and how does it relate to military technology? In very simple terms, this is the view that U.S. public support for war is sensitive to U.S. casualties, that as casualties go up, public support for war goes down. In democracies where public support matters to elected officials, politicians pay attention to levels of support and will go to great lengths to protect U.S. forces, including by supporting investment in military technologies that mitigate risk to U.S. lives and also to innocent civilians. In essence, it is the belief that all things being equal, the public wants to avoid its soldiers dying on the battlefield, and that political leaders pay attention and make choices based on that public sentiment. Casualty aversion, or the desire to protect U.S. forces from harm, wasn't new to Vietnam. Public opinion about casualties has influenced U.S. decision-makers since the advent of the American military and can certainly be seen during the World Wars. This is Peter Fever, Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at Duke University and an expert in civil-military relations.
It turns out that some myths emerged over the decades about the public's attitudes towards casualties. One of the myths was that if it's a good war, then the public doesn't care about casualties. And if it's a bad war, then the American public really cares a lot about casualties. It's a good war, World War II, bad war, Korea and Vietnam. And so Vietnam, we couldn't fight because Americans cared too much about casualties. In World War II, we didn't care about casualties because it was the good war. Actually, when you dig into the historical record more closely, you realize the public did care about casualties in World War II. Senior leaders, Roosevelt on down, very in World War II. And indeed, on the 80th anniversary this year of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that was all about minimizing U.S. casualties, a way to end the war at lower cost to the United States.
Despite this history, our story emphasizes the important role of Vietnam because of the impact that this experience in particular had on a group of very influential officers. A cadre who went on to staff the most powerful officers, from the Pentagon to the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, to the Air War College to the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, to the Air War College at Montgomery. What they thought and the lessons they took from Vietnam mattered because of the positions that they would go on to fill. Moreover, the beliefs that these officers took away from Vietnam fundamentally differed from a generation of officers before them. The generals that led Vietnam campaigns, leaders like Abrams and Westmoreland, had a very different belief about how America won wars. They saw U.S. victories in Europe, Japan, and to some extent Korea, and believed that the American way of winning wars was to demonstrate the will of the American people to create and to sustain enemy loss at a higher rate than friendly casualties. For these leaders, friendly loss was an intervening variable in the ultimate strategic success, but not the primary determinant. Technology's primary role was not to defend or protect the force, but instead to create mass amounts of firepower to increase the ratio of enemy to friendly loss. While Abrams and Westmoreland may have believed in the strategic advantage of attrition campaigns over time, the politicians defending their decision to commit American personnel lives in Vietnam were not as convinced that the United States could stomach the friendly losses required to win against the North Vietnamese. Though there was support for the war in its early stages as part of a policy of containment and to stem the tide of communism in Asia, this quickly changed as U.S. military and civilian deaths mounted. The televised nature of the war had a big impact on U.S. public opinion. It was the first time that the American public was able to viscerally experience the realities of combat while sitting in the comfort of their living rooms, with journalists embedded on the front lines reporting back daily to the American people.
American soldiers hiking their way through the sweaty jungles of South Vietnam, searching for an elusive enemy. The temperature is almost 100 degrees, and the jungle stifles even the tiniest breeze. The going is slow. There could be a North Vietnamese regiment hiding a few yards away, and no one would see it. Nobody talks, so you start thinking. Specialist 4, Dwayne Boer, is thinking he's going to meet his fiancée in Honolulu in 2 weeks, and he will show her the silver star the general pinned on him yesterday. DeValle is the lone medic in the platoon. He's scared from the moment he gets out of the chopper to the moment it picks him up. Scared that someday he's going to get killed picking up a wounded buddy.
The day after Johnson announced he wouldn't run for re-election, he reflected on the impact of television on public opinion of the war and of his presidency. He said, "I thought of the many times each week when television brings the war into the American home," adding, "Historians must only guess at the effect that television would have had during earlier conflicts on the future of this nation. During the Korean War, for example, at that time when our forces were pushed back there to Busan, or World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, or when our men were slugging it out in Europe, or when most of our Air Force was shot down that day in June 1942 off Australia. American military officers were especially wary of how the television coverage of Vietnam affected the American public, and blamed the reporting for much of the loss of public support for the war. Westmoreland repeatedly blamed the media for slanted coverage and, ultimately, for contributing to the U.S. failure in Vietnam. Decades after the Vietnam War, Westmoreland continued to blame Walter Cronkite's pessimistic take on the Tet Offensive for crippling public support and influencing the Johnson administration to adopt less optimal strategies. Here is Walter Cronkite addressing the country in February 1968.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
As early as 1965, President Johnson was looking for technological alternatives to a casualty-heavy strategy and said to his Secretary of Defense, Bob McNamara, "I don't think there's any way, Bob, that through your small planes or helicopters, you could spot these people and then radio back and let the planes come in and bomb the hell out of them?" The desire to mitigate risk to U.S. military personnel in Vietnam led to important developments in unmanned technologies on the battlefield. McNamara invested in a weapons program that included anti-infiltration barriers of mines, fencing, and barbed wire, all monitored by a series of unmanned sensors and manned patrols. The barrier had tactical successes, but it couldn't change strategic outcomes. Nevertheless, the experimentation led to one of the first machine integrations of information within a real-time display, a harbinger of later machine learning-enabled operating pictures. As the Vietnam War waged on and Nixon struggled with public opinion about the loss of American lives, his cabinet increasingly looked for technology to substitute for American lives and to minimize civilian casualties. Future Secretary of Defense Bill Perry led the development of an unmanned intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance collection outpost for the U.S. Army that eventually evolved into an unmanned aircraft guardrail program. The unmanned system, requested by the Army and the National Security Agency, was developed to solve a fundamental problem for their intelligence collection efforts. Manned listening posts were dangerous, and the Army was losing too many of their intelligence officers. An unmanned listening outpost could substitute equipment for personnel, an inherently less risky choice. This experimentation with unmanned systems in Vietnam was foundational for Perry and influenced his later support for unmanned technologies in the late 1990s. The domestic political situation created by Vietnam was exacerbated by the advent of Soviet surface-to-air missiles, which made American pilots vulnerable to shoot down and capture. This confluence of tactical and political issues opened an aperture for bottom-up experimentation and empowered the Air Force's Tactical Air Command to steer autonomous systems away from their previous strategic focus. Unmanned aircraft flown as decoys and jammers, early laser-guided and inertial navigation bombs, anti-radiation homing missiles, and infrared-guided air-to-air missiles all debuted in Vietnam as technological solutions to tactical problems. Jim Roche, who went on to become Secretary of the Air Force and ultimately armed the MQ-1 Predator, first interacted with unmanned systems in Vietnam with an experimental use of a remote relayed unmanned helicopter and sensor to conduct intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance along the Vietnam coast. This memory of the utility of unmanned systems stuck with Roche, as did his experiences as a combat search and rescue helicopter pilot. As he noted, "I spent too much time in Vietnam picking up down pilots and crying at night because I couldn't pick up guys that I wanted to pick up." But the future Secretary of the Air Force's Vietnam experience was also showing him how unmanned technology might keep those pilots out of danger.
In Vietnam, I did search and rescue up off of Haiphong, and they had another destroyer, be near my destroyer too. It had guns, and I had modern destroyer, but it didn't have as many guns. So I had an old destroyer, which was a shotgun, literally a shotgun. And we were up close, so we saw our own things go through their thing, and the North Vietnamese. North Vietnamese did not have missile drones like we did. Ours were mainly for intelligence. So one of the questions we had was, where were the North Vietnamese keeping their PT boats? And that was our problem. And I'll tell you, a little boat just flying around you is like having a damn gnat around your face.
The young Navy officer Roche knew of a solution: unmanned drones that could go places, small places, hidden places, and dangerous places, to find the gnat so the bigger Navy guns could go out and swat the PT boats.
The ship gets him that fast, the guns go all over, and you'll have to shoot you on another ship. So we worried about them. Well, one day, the carrier could launch them, and they would come back out to sea, and then pop a parachute, fall in the water, as predetermined point where there were some small boats to pick them up, take them back to the carrier. They fired one, and it went over land in Haiphong, and it got lost. We lost it. I don't know what the hell happened to it. And about an hour later, it popped up and it decided to come home. So here it comes home over the water. At first, we don't know if it's still working. And it got to the right spot. It popped this little chute, came down. And it was a good size, hidden under the hospital. So what the North Vietnamese did was they had them hidden, and there was a hospital. We wouldn't bother the hospital. So we had to wait for them to come out of there. And it got to the point where they just didn't bother us very much after that. So that was the use of an unmanned system. It was not remotely piloted. It was pre-programmed. And it had a flight, and it's just, we don't know where it went, but when on its own, it found some things we never could have found on our own. We would never have thought to look inside under the hospital to see if we could find big PCBs. So that always led me to say, okay, we can do things with these things.
Vietnam provided an opportunity for early experimentation of precision-guided munitions. Tactical Air Command repurposed a radar bombing method called Sky Spot from Strategic Air Command to guide otherwise dumb bombs from B-52s in what was one of the early innovations in precision-guided munitions. The use of off-board and on-board radar sensors to guide bombs set the stage for more autonomous munitions with longer and smarter handoffs. The increasing effectiveness of the manned platforms that dropped the bombs meant that early guided munition innovations in Vietnam, including the Bullpup, Shrike, and Walleye bombs, were primarily naval. However, as the conflict progressed, the Air Force adapted Navy innovations and developed its own smart munitions, including the homing bomb system, electro-optical guided GBU-15, rocket-propelled Maverick, and paveway laser-guided bombs. Even the AIM-7 Sparrow air-to-air missile got a jump start during Vietnam. Tactical Air Command also convinced Strategic Air Command to reapportion the Lightning Bug, an unmanned reconnaissance system, from a strategic reconnaissance mission to a tactical support role. The Lightning Bug and later Buffalo Hunter drones flew over 4,000 sorties in Vietnam, serving as bait for manned missions, taking photos of Vietnamese surface-to-air missiles and prison camps, conducting poor weather battle damage assessments, and dropping propaganda leaflets. The drones were useful complements to manned bombing runs, because they were small and flew at low altitudes and high speeds and were hard to detect. Further, the systems were supported by electronic countermeasures and remotely controlled, allowing pilots to maneuver and evade threats. It wasn't full autonomy, but it was a model for remote-controlled, unmanned piloting that adapted well to the tactical airfight. All these systems paved the way for the precision-guided munition revolution that was looming on the horizon. By 1972, with public polls increasingly suggesting the American public was more likely to support bombing over ground campaigns, technology became a key component of Nixon's casualty-sensitive strategy. B-52s equipped with the first high-precision bombs were now able to execute bombing runs from increasingly safe high altitudes. But it wasn't enough. In the end, those technological advancements that mitigated risk to friendlies and took the American GI further from the battlefield were not sufficient to either shore up American public support or to win the war. Here is former Secretary of State John Kerry addressing Congress in 1971 on behalf of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War.
Each day, to facilitate the process by which the United States washes her hands of Vietnam, someone has to give up his life, so that the United States doesn't have to admit something that the entire world already knows, so that we can't say that we've made a mistake. Someone has to die so that President Nixon won't be, and these are his words, the first president to lose a war. And we are asking Americans to think about that. Because how do you ask a man to be the last man to die in Vietnam? How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? We are here to ask, and we're here to ask vehemently, where are the leaders of our country? Where is the leadership?
As Krapenovich concludes, U.S. withdrawal from the ground war against the insurgents could have been sped up by accepting higher casualty rates, but this would have had to been weighed against the accelerated erosion in U.S. popular support for the war effort. The experience of Vietnam and its outcome laid the groundwork for a new theory of victory among the young officers of its time. They pointed to the pivotal role that televised images of body bags and body counts played in decimating public support for the war, and linked this effect to the United States withdrawal. From this belief came a drive for unmanned technology to protect the U.S. armed forces and mitigate the effect of public casualty aversion. Ultimately, the lesson these officers took from Vietnam was that public sensitivity to loss leads American policymakers to choose technologies and operations that may insulate them from the political ramifications of body bags on the nightly news, but potentially at the cost of strategic success. These young officers, coming of age at the advent of the microprocessor and major computer advances, couldn't influence politicians, but they saw in technology an opportunity to substitute for human risk, potentially without sacrificing battlefield effectiveness. Their conclusion? Lives were expensive. Technology could make up for that strategic cost. In the years following Vietnam, this created one of the strongest trajectories for unmanned systems as substitutions for manned platforms that increased the physical distance between the human and the battlefield, while still maintaining control and precision. This wasn't about using unmanned systems to create quicker engagements or to condense the sensor-shooter timeline, but instead to provide humans on the battlefield with resources for force protection. This sometimes led to unmanned systems with significant logistical tails, limited automation, and high overall cost. However, these were acceptable trade-offs for systems that could potentially limit the scope of violence and conflict. And these beliefs are reflected in the doctrines and weapons acquisitions programs of the 1970s and 80s that would create a trajectory for weapons designed for quick, overwhelming, and low-casualty wars. Following the Vietnam War, U.S. defense expenditures declined. Warsaw Pact forces outnumbered NATO forces by 3-1 in Europe, and the Department of Defense didn't have the funds to increase forces sufficiently to match. Secretary of Defense Harold Brown therefore sought technological means to offset the numerical advantages held by U.S. adversaries and restore deterrent stability in Europe. Secretary Brown's offset strategy built on the developments of Vietnam and emphasized new intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, improvements in precision-guided weapons, stealth technology, and space-based military communications and navigation, all with the goal of insulating the public from U.S. casualties to enable strategic success. In the mid-1970s, at an Army installation in the suburbs of Virginia, General William Depew, the first commander of the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, led the Army's first major doctrine rewrite since Vietnam. Depew isn't an unmanned influencer like Shriver or Rickover, but he plays a large role in how the Army begins to shape beliefs about technology and the American way of war post-Vietnam.
Depew had this massive, quick rise in the Army, but he was always a very conceptual thinker.
That's Professor and Army Officer Ben Jensen that we first met in Episode 1. He wrote a book on the evolution of Army doctrine.
He later was a division commander in Vietnam. He actually even was attached to the CIA to kind of quietly advise groups we were trying to get to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party in the 1950s. And really where he comes into the act here is he basically writes a memo, has a 3-star, to invent this thing called Training and Doctrine Command. Like, he basically does the ultimate staff officer ninjutsu. He writes a paper about the position he wants, he staffs it, and gets the position created. And the idea was, and again, he'd been a division commander in Vietnam, and he was always obsessed with tactical level details. He believed that if you trained 100 soldiers the right way, they could kick the crap out of any 500. So he believed that combat power and lethality emerged as a function of training and education, not just in terms of how many push-ups or pull-ups you can do or how slick you look with your hair back. And he was very adamant about this. And so I say that because Act 1 is this staff officer creating an entirely new 4-star command and using it as a forcing function to kind of pull the Army out of Vietnam, to pull the Army away from Vietnam in terms of a lot of the lapses of professionalism. People were really good warriors, but we forget that there were race riots, tensions, drug addiction, all sorts of complex kind of military and society issues in Vietnam that he had to grapple with. And 2, you have also this emergence of the professional force. So you're at this critical kind of social and political junction, and at the same time, you have all of this wild kind of pent-up demand way before this is decade before really the kind of Reagan defense bump where the Army was broke, right? There wasn't necessarily going to be the marginal defense dollar was going to nuclear weapons and the Air Force wasn't coming to the Army. So in some ways, whether it's because of his personal experience or bureaucratic necessity, he has this idea of developing a new doctrine and changing how the Army trains for war. And it's called active defense.
Depew and his staff drew heavily from lessons learned in the Arab-Israeli wars. He watched the advent of long-range precision strike and anti-tank missiles and observed that what can be seen can be hit, and what can be hit can be killed. His team concluded that technology would create a large-scale advantage for those states able to harness the new technologies, but that the technologies would heavily advantage defense by imposing lethal cost on attackers. Active defense, as the doctrine was known, recognized the increasing importance of technology to warfare, but saw its main impact in creating firepower and lethality. This was not what the young officers from Vietnam wanted to hear. They were convinced that the only way to ensure public support was to design a doctrine that enabled short and overwhelming conflicts that mitigated loss of American lives. They saw technology not primarily as a means to create firepower and lethality, but instead as a way to enable high-maneuver, offensively dominated campaigns. Met with widespread unpopularity, the active defense doctrine lasted only one assignment cycle. Now enter air-land battle, a new doctrine that took the beliefs from Vietnam and applied new technology to create campaigns that decreased casualties by striking first and winning quickly. Perhaps most important for our story, air-land battle was the first real call for unmanned aerial vehicles within a surface-wide strategy, and crucially, it was accompanied by the largest acquisition program to occur before the end of the Cold War. Air-land battle's acquisition initiative called for remotely piloted vehicles, tactical satellites, long-range artillery fires, medium-range ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles and mines, all linked together by network and sensor capabilities. The doctrine embraced and capitalized on technological advances since Vietnam, especially in microprocessing and the precision capabilities that enabled. Whereas 1950s inertial guidance had an accuracy of 0.03 degrees per hour, by 1970, this inaccuracy was down to 0.005 degrees. Further, whereas previously inertial systems' large size, 300 pounds, had necessitated larger cruise missiles, post-microprocessor inertial navigation systems were only 29 pounds. These smaller, more maneuverable munitions, in conjunction with new computer-enhanced terrain mapping capabilities, meant that the cruise missile of the 1970s was more survivable against Soviet surface-to-air missiles than many manned aircraft. The cruise missile also skirted around the constraints of the Strategic Arms Limitations Agreements that capped the quantity of ballistic missiles. Then Deputy Director of Defense for Research and Engineering William Perry argued that precision strike advances offered the greatest single potential for force multiplication to meet the Soviet threat in Europe, because they had the potential for revolutionizing warfare and would greatly advance our ability to deter war without having to compete tank for tank, missile for missile. In short, air-land battle provided the doctrinal transition between the experimentation with unmanned systems in Vietnam and a theory of warfare in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It also came in the midst of a major reshuffling within the Department of Defense. In 1986, Congress passed the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which, among other things, created a more powerful chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and incentives for the always bickering services to work together to acquire and equip the armed forces. The reform induced the Army and the Air Force to work together on air-land battle, though the partnership was in some ways more of a frenemy situationship than a pure collaboration. Ben Jensen again.
One school of thought is that basically the Army had a bigger crush on the Air Force than the Air Force had on the Army. So really, the Army kind of thought they were dating the Air Force, but the Air Force was just over them. And I think what you have there is, I don't think it's all reduced to budget politics and bureaucratic maneuvering, but if you look at it from that line, it's in the Air Force's TAC Air Force fighter mafia interest to show a little love to the Army as they're maneuvering versus the kind of bomber mafia. And so I think you could make an argument and go look about how this helps the Air Force then justify certain budget capture, certain type of tails. So it's still part of the Air Force in terms of at least the fighter side, not at all the bomber side, though, in strategic attack. And I think you could probably draw that out to find out why the Army is actually behind on unmanned systems and aerial unmanned systems in that respect, compared to, for example, the Marine Corps.
And it wasn't just the Army that was interested in unmanned systems. The Navy jumped onto unmanned systems after suffering losses in Lebanon. After Vietnam, the US had remained engaged in conflicts in the Middle East, including a small contingent of Marines on the ground and Navy vessels as part of a multinational peacekeeping coalition in Lebanon. In October 1983, 241 Marines were killed by suicide bomber attacks on the Marine barracks in Beirut. Just a few months later, during a routine air patrol, Syrians shot down 3 Navy aircraft, killing 2 pilots and capturing 1. Decision-makers were desperate for an unmanned alternative. After the loss of the pilots, the Navy and Marines recommended that the Navy acquire the Israeli UAV system, and the US purchased the Pioneer UAV shortly after that. But while the Israelis had used the unmanned aerial vehicles for early warning and detection within manned suppression of enemy air defense packages, then Secretary of Defense Weinberger and the Navy bought the systems chiefly as a replacement for otherwise risky manned reconnaissance missions. These unmanned systems would not be used in the integrated sensor-shooter tactics envisaged by the Israelis, but instead to increase persistent surveillance as a force protection measure for ground and naval troops. They were meant explicitly to decrease the chance of losing a human pilot. In 1984, shortly after the devastating loss of the Marines in Lebanon, Weinberger unveiled a new doctrine. The Weinberger Doctrine detailed 6 criteria for the use of the American military, including that, first, the conflict involved vital national interests of the United States. Second, that troops be committed wholeheartedly and with the clear intention of winning. Third, that there were clearly defined political and military objectives, which then led to 4, adjustments to the size and composition of forces to make sure that the military could accomplish those objectives, and that 5, U.S. troops should not be committed to battle without a reasonable assurance of the support of U.S. public and Congress. Together, all these criteria would lead to number 6, the use of U.S. troops only as a last resort. The Weinberger Doctrine codified the beliefs created by Vietnam into a military directive. The need to maintain public support to ensure strategic success was now an official tenet of the U.S. military. The beliefs that had emerged from the failure in Vietnam would further cascade in the mid-1980s as the young officers of Vietnam stepped into senior leadership roles within the DoD. This new guard of officers were led by a young new chief of staff of the Army, Carl Vuerno, and were determined not to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors, which they saw chiefly as a deficit in the political and public support they needed to win conflict. This view was also espoused from a man who became uniquely powerful in the U.S. military establishment. In 1989, General Colin Powell became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, an auspicious time to influence the U.S. military given the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union and the recent change in the nature and influence of this position. In a unique way in American history, Powell's beliefs mattered. And for Powell, the belief in American public casualty aversion was strong. As he explained in his memoir, war should be the politics of last resort, and when we go to war, we should have a purpose that our people understand and support. We should mobilize the country's resources to fulfill that mission and then go in to win. In Vietnam, we had entered into a half-hearted half-war, with much of the nation opposed or indifferent, while a small fraction carried the burden. So that brings us to the end of this episode. We've covered a lot of ground from the early years of Vietnam through the 1970s and 80s up to the end of the Cold War. What we've seen is how a belief that emerges from first-hand experience on the battlefields of Vietnam, ultimately about the relationship between the U.S. public and the wars that it sanctions, shapes the thinking, doctrine, and investments in unmanned technologies over subsequent decades. This belief guides investments in unmanned technologies that insulate military forces from risk by substituting unmanned for manned platforms that can be used by an operator and remotely. This isn't about speeding up decisions on the battlefield or reducing the temporal distance between sensor and shooter. It's about creating a physical distance and providing persistence and loiter capabilities so that decisions that decrease the chance of unnecessary loss of life, both friendly and civilian, are optimized. On preventing civilian casualties as well as providing force protection, Peter Fever adds,
policymakers over the last 80 years have become more and more attuned to this and the need to reduce civilian casualties as well. And again, the contrast with the battles that were fought 80 years ago in 1945 the firebombing of Tokyo, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, huge numbers of civilian casualties that were inflicted so as to save U.S. combat casualties. That trade-off, policymakers today, or up until the Trump administration at least, the American policymakers said, we're not going to do that anymore. So we are going to reduce our own combat casualties and we're going to reduce their civilian casualties. And that's required much greater precision in fires and in targeting and, of course, in force protection, our own force protection.
In sum, unmanned technologies provide a technological solution to the constraints decision makers believe are imposed by the American public's casualty aversion. In the next episode, we're going to look at another important belief that has shaped debates around unmanned technology, the belief that just around the corner, there was a military revolution on the way. I'm Julia.
And I'm Jackie.
This is the Hand Behind Unmanned podcast. If you liked it, buy the book. It's by Oxford University Press and available on Amazon.
Thanks for listening. Episode 4, American Primacy and the Information Revolution, setting the scene for the Predator.
The operation underway tonight, taking place in the pre-dawn darkness of the Persian Gulf, involves allied air forces of 4 nations: the United States, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. As they undertake their missions, they do so after months of careful planning. At the direction of the President, great care has been taken to focus on military targets, to minimize U.S. casualties, and to do everything possible to avoid injury to civilians in Iraq and Kuwait.
Welcome to The Hand Behind Unmanned, a podcast about how America fights war without human beings, told from the perspective of the human beings making those choices. I'm Jackie Schneider.
And I'm Julia McDonald. In this podcast, we take you inside weapons budget lines and behind classified program doors to understand not only what unmanned technology the U.S. military bought, but why. For those of you who came for the technology, we hope you'll stay for the people, because this really is a story about remarkable humans, historical junctures, and our beliefs about the future of war and what that means for unmanned weapons we buy.
Along the way in our unmanned journey, we'll learn valuable lessons about how technology shapes the winners and losers in war, how humans and technology interact at a time when the march of technological progress seems inevitable, how public funds get invested when it comes to warfare, and above all, the human hands at the heart of unmanned technology. Last episode, we were in Vietnam, exploring how the battlefield experiences of a generation of officers, the creation of a new all-volunteer force, and the advent of the microprocessor spurred tactical unmanned innovation. Along with this innovation came a powerful belief in technology's ability to substitute for human loss. It was a response to what these battle-hardened officers saw as the CNN effect, the way in which a casualty-averse public responded to the war they saw broadcasted into their living rooms. And for the first time, maybe ever, the chimera of unmanned technology that made war less violent, less dangerous, more remote, seemed less like myth and more like a reality just in our grasp. It was up to a small office in the bowels of the Pentagon, with no budget authority, no war campaigns, no normal way of changing the arsenal, to bring an information age America into this new unmanned reality. The Reagan administration injected a mass infusion of funding into the last American military of the Cold War. It galvanized the technologies of air-land battle, and then the wall fell.
I'm Peter Jennings in New York. Just a short while ago, astonishing news from East Germany, where the East German authorities have said, in essence, that the Berlin Wall doesn't mean anything anymore. The wall that the East Germans put up in 1961 to keep its people in will now be breached by anybody who wants to leave.
Suddenly, perhaps surprisingly, the U.S. was the global superpower. And all those technologies that the U.S. had built in a world of nuclear competition with the Soviet Union were going to make their debut not in the Fulda Gap, but instead in an Arabian desert. But before we make our way to the Middle East, we need to come back to a powerful idea about the role of unmanned technology in modern warfare. So what's the idea? Well, simply, it's the belief that sometimes a technology comes around that's so important that it creates a fundamental, even revolutionary shift in military power. Those countries that are able to harness those technologies in society and in their militaries leapfrog technological laggards, creating what we might call a military revolution or a revolution in military affairs, as Dr. Thomas Mencken, scholar and strategist, explains.
Briefly, the idea of a military revolution is that in some periods of history, new developments of technology to fundamentally change the character of war. You could think in firepower and maneuver, offense, defense, space and time.
Now, this might be where the contemporary listener thinks, wait, I've heard this before. And yes, you have.
We believe, in particular, Dr. Kissinger believed, that the AI revolution is of the scale of the Reformation.
But AI is not the first technology to be credited as revolutionary. And contrary to what Eric Schmidt might have said there, historians have identified a series of technological revolutions over the last half a century. From the development of the longbow to the gun, steam, telegraph, railroad, and mechanization. Dr. Andren, one of the early authors of the military revolution concept, identified a series of these events.
If you look at the, say, the era that begins with the Industrial Revolution around the beginning of the 19th century, there have been several since then. So in the mid-19th century, there's the so-called railroad rifle telegraph revolution, where the electromagnetic spectrum comes into play with the telegraph system. And that enables us to coordinate the movement of troops much more effectively than we have before. And that the advent of railroads and rifling, which increases weapon accuracy, really improves the capability of military forces. And around that time, you also have advances in propulsion. You know, the steam engines enable railroads. They also shift dramatically the way that naval ships operate. And so during that period of time, we go from wooden ships to metal ships and from wind propulsion to steam propulsion. And that changes warfare at sea dramatically. Wooden ships really don't stand a chance against these new ironclad ships. Turn of the 20th century, war begins to go undersea with submarines, and it begins to go into the air with aircraft. And of course, they become formidable new weapons of war and, again, enormous boost in military capability over time. There's the so-called mechanization, aviation, radio revolution. That leads to things like Blitzkrieg and the fast carrier task forces that are new kinds of military systems in World War II. And again, enormous boost in effectiveness. Nobody really needs to define the nuclear revolution that occurs at the end of the war. That sort of stands on its own. So you have these periods where there are these disruptive shifts. And the key is, it's been talked about in the business literature, the difference between innovation and disruptive innovation. And so in a military sense, innovation would be something akin to using radar to enable ships to shoot more accurately. So you're operating within an existing military regime. You're getting better at what you're already doing. And disruptive innovation is essentially doing something very different from what you have been doing in order to realize a large boost in effectiveness.
The corollary, of course, is that those who fail to adapt quickly enough to a military revolution will decrease in power, ultimately descending into historical oblivion. Indeed, the idea of a bumbling officer unable to see the impact of new technology on warfare is a constant theme in the military revolution literature. No one wanted to be Field Marshal Haig after World War I and the invention of the machine gun, the tank, and the airplane, still extolling the virtues of the horse for modern combat. Perhaps counterintuitively, what would become a strongly American view of war originated not within American philosophy, but instead with the Soviets, who first crafted the military technical revolution narrative. The Soviets were looking at these missile technologies and early computer sensors showing up in Israel and Arab states, and they saw something special, something that might just look like a new revolution in technology, a revolution they called a reconnaissance strike complex. Thomas Mencken again.
It really was in the context of nuclear weapons that the Soviets first advanced this notion of a revolution in military affairs, or a military technical revolution. So now smash cut to the 1970s, late 1970s, where the U.S. military faces a challenge posed by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and the challenge of defending NATO, defending Central Europe and Western Europe against an onslaught by the Warsaw Pact. The U.S. military started to innovate in response to this threat, and they developed air-land battle. They developed a whole generation of precision-guided munitions, deep sensing, new command and control capabilities. The Soviets looked at that, and they started to write about the advent of a new revolution in military affairs, which again wasn't the way we were thinking about it at the time, but it's the way the Soviets conceptualized it. And it was those Soviet writings that the began to read and began to pay attention to.
We're back in that unremarkable office in the bowels of the Pentagon. It's the 1970s, and America is having a bit of a tough time after our retreat from Vietnam, an impeached president, and an economy suffering from both inflation and high unemployment. Here's Andrew Krapinovich to explain.
In terms of basic strategy, the Americans needed to find a new source of advantage. They had lost the nuclear advantage. And at the time, in the middle 70s, when the Carter administration came into power, you had Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, who was very familiar with technology and so on. He had a technological background. And his director of research and engineering was another guy, Bill Perry, who would go on to become Secretary of Defense 20 years later. But Perry also had a very strong background in this area. And Brown and Perry also had a close relationship with Andy Marshall, who was running the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. And the question was, what new source of competitive advantage can we develop relative to the Soviets? And they settled on information technologies. The information revolution was just beginning. And so that was the offset strategy. That was the title that was given to it. And we were going to offset our loss in advantage in one area, the nuclear area, by developing advantages in this new area.
So now it's time to introduce the remarkable man running an unremarkable office that will create one of the most influential beliefs in the modern American military. Before Instagram and TikTok and Twitter, Andy Marshall was the original American military influencer. He built a network of up-and-coming experts, invested in historians and political scientists, bankrolled think tanks, and ran war games, all to propagate a set of beliefs so fundamental to the American understanding of war in the information age that it has now permeated the language of technology and history writ large. Who was Andy Marshall? Again, strategist and former Office of Net Assessment scholar Thomas Mencken.
Andy Marshall was a very important American strategic thinker. And I say that because even before he came to Washington, D.C., before he eventually came to lead the Office of Net Assessment, he was a significant figure at the Rand Corporation. At Rand, he played a really important role in helping us understand how decision makers make decisions based on imperfect information, how bureaucratic politics influence decisions, a lot of the things that we kind of take as just sort of, settled right now. He was one of the key people to help develop that. And then in the early 1970s, he came to Washington, D.C., Kissinger on the National Security Council staff, and then to set up the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon. And he went on to have, I would say, a second full career as director of the Office of Net Assessment. He was originally appointed during the Nixon administration, and he eventually retired during the Obama administration. And to put that into context, when he retired from the Office of Net Assessment, but then also considering his previous Rand career, he retired after 65 years of public service. Not at age 65, but after 65 years of public service, which I think is just an amazing accomplishment that will likely go unmatched.
Marshall's staff and budget were small. He had no authority to acquire technology, invest in research and development, or develop campaign plans or strategy. Almost none of the tools usually required to create a large shift in weapons trajectories. He was extraordinarily savvy. And in the early 80s, Marshall believed the Soviets were onto something. A hunch that seemed to be validated by the 1982 Israeli war in Lebanon and the resounding success of Israeli high-technology tactics in the Bekaa Valley, including the Israeli use of drones and precision-guided munitions. By the mid-1980s, Marshall began in earnest to focus his staff on fleshing out the Soviet beliefs. Meanwhile, Marshall started creating networks of influence for these beliefs. In 1986, Marshall organized a working group as part of a commission on long-term thinking led by Albert Wohlstetter, an early believer in military technological transformations and one of Marshall's early colleagues at Rand. The group included hand-picked, innovative, and strategic thinkers, many of them young voices within the Pentagon, to include Elliot Cohen, James Roche, Stephen Rosen, and others. This group and their burgeoning beliefs about a military technological revolution proved influential in the Commission's final report. Importantly for our story about unmanned technology, the report highlighted the role of unmanned vehicles, smart mines, and cruise missiles as replacements for more expensive manned aircraft. The seed of an idea was planted. But Marshall wasn't going to just stand back and hope it grew on its own. Here once again is Andrew Krapinovich.
In 1989, Marshall calls me in and says, the Russians are writing about this military technical revolution. He said, I want to know these things. Come back and take a year and come back and tell me, number one, do you think the Russians are right? Number two, if they are right, what do we do? What does this mean for us? How do we change the way we compete? Third, if we think they're wrong, how do we help them go down this wrong path? How do we get them to spend a lot of money on things we think aren't going to be effective? But fourth, if we think they're wrong, but they turn out to be right, what are the hedges? What are the things we need to put in place so that if history proves them right, we can very quickly offset their advantage?
Marshall and the Commission were hugely influential, and an example of how policy entrepreneurs can directly influence budget lines solely through belief propagation. However, despite Marshall's efforts, his early work to shepherd the idea of military revolutions could have been overshadowed by the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Cold War was over, and with it the impetus and budgets for a massive technological modernization. For all intents and purposes, the idea of military revolutions and its implications for unmanned systems should have been done. But this was an opportunity for Marshall. With the demise of the United States as principal adversary, Marshall recognized a vacuum of ideas and increased efforts to insert the military revolution as the primary strategic thought for a post-Cold War United States. And war, as always, could catalyze those ideas.
In the first day of fighting, in which more than 1,400 sorties have been flown, the U.S. says it has lost one pilot and one airplane, largely because missiles are being used to pave the way. This is what Iraq faces: devastatingly accurate cruise missiles launched from ships at targets too well defended to be attacked by warplanes.
The war in Iraq unveiled new technologies and a concept of operations dazzlingly effective against what was thought to be a formidable Iraqi force. A combination of massive air support of both manned platforms and smart munitions, early digital coordination, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance enabled a quick and decisive victory over one of the largest military forces in the world, all with only losing approximately 150 American forces. There were a lot of reasons why the U.S. won the war so decisively, but for many, the war was a validation of the ideas about technology and military revolutions. In an after-action report examining the somewhat unexpected success of the war, Dick Cheney, then Secretary of Defense, attributed much to the revolutionary narrative, declaring that the Gulf War demonstrated drastically the new possibilities of what has been called the military technological revolution in warfare, in which precision-guided munitions proved immensely effective. While merely a note in the Department of Defense's report to Congress on the conduct of war, even the Pioneer UAV was highlighted as valuable and appears to have validated the operational employment of UAVs in combat. The information revolution was coming together for the American military. Andrew Kripanovich once again.
And you have, at least in the American terminology, three components, sort of the scouting force, which we would call ISR, information, surveillance and reconnaissance. And then the battle network, the C4, command, control, communications, and computers. And then finally, the precision strike element, precision weapons and stealth aircraft. And the first time the world really saw this integration, even in sort of a primitive form, was in the first Gulf War. And everyone, I think, I was working at the Pentagon at the time, everyone was surprised at how remarkably effective this combination was.
If, after Vietnam, the U.S. military was worried about the CNN effect, the Gulf War and embedded reporters showcased the new generation of cruise missiles and precision-guided munitions, and how these technologies could enable the U.S. to fight wars of choice without risking human life. Perhaps unintentionally at first, these military revolution beliefs found an ally in the other dominant belief of the time, the belief we discussed in the previous episode, a belief in the need to prioritize force protection and shield a casualty-averse American public. And these beliefs found some allies within the armed services. Air Force ideological leaders like Colonel John Warden, who saw in the Gulf War an opportunity to shape a new theory of warfare that supported both the dominant beliefs of the day and the Air Force's core identity. As he explained in an interview, the American belief that technology can solve a lot of things really led over the course of time to American wars that were less bloody than those fought by folks who were not as technologically advanced. Technology has driven to shorter wars that are less casualty intensive. This was the promise that Andy Marshall was wading into after the Gulf War. Information age technology that could allow the U.S. to opt into the wars it wanted, and with very little risk to American service members. Defense intellectuals flocked to the idea, and Marshall's investments in historians like Williamson Murray, McGregor Knox, strategists at think tanks like the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Analysis, and war games run by young officers like Michael Vickers solidified the power of military revolutions for a post-Cold War American military. The idea proliferated even outside the inner circle of the Office of Net Assessment, to civilians in charge of offices with real budgets and real authority to invest in the technologies, including missiles and satellites and drones, all technologies that were a part of the ideas first articulated by Marshall's office in the 1980s. For example, Frank Kendall, who is leading defense programs with real budgets in research and engineering, and who had become the future undersecretary in charge of all acquisition technology and logistics, and most recently, the Secretary of the Air Force, began to turn the ideas from an unremarkable office in the Pentagon into very real Pentagon weapon programs.
I was a Cold Warrior for 20 years, right? In the Pentagon, I was responsible for a lot of those programs that we demonstrated in the first Gulf War. And I wrote one of the earlier articles on what I call the revolution in military technology. And then RMA became the more popular way to talk about that. Initially, it was very much reconnaissance and surveillance, right? I got deeply involved, I guess, starting when I was director of tactical warfare programs back in the late 80s and early 90s. And we were, since had a lot of potential. We call it Dick Rump from the Navy. We were working in parallel with what we were doing to try to get some things fielded. The industry was trying to move forward because some people in the industry saw the potential as well.
Coming out of the Gulf War, the armed services also began to buy into the idea of military revolutions, though each interpreted the belief in ways that fit their core identity, with implications for the unmanned arsenal. Here's military innovation scholar Ben Jensen on Gordon Sullivan, Chief of Staff of the Army in the Clinton years, and a former Vietnam veteran.
I think what the most interesting evolution in the Army actually goes back to the 90s and Gordon Sullivan, and think he's the biggest thinker in the Army that not enough people pay attention to. Gordon Sullivan kind of sees the future before the technology gets there in his idea of kind of an information age Army and what it would mean to truly digitize the Army, which leads to all sorts of innovations. You already had some of it happening in ATAFID, so kind of an TAC fire, so 70s and 1980s era computers for helping you work with artillery fires. But Sullivan imagines this almost as what we see now of these smaller form computers and sensors that are on everything. And what would that mean for how you see yourself, you see the battlefield, and what often in some of the writing of that time called battle space geometry. And Sullivan really pushed hard to both change the Army institutionally to do that, and then to do all these experiments with Force 21, which later became the Army After Next, which really sets the stage for then the later early 2000s future combat system.
For the Navy, the Gulf War demonstrated the effectiveness of the Tomahawk cruise missile, a precision-guided munition fired from surface ships and submarines that they had first begun to develop in the 1970s. The Tomahawk, with its long ranges and new cutting-edge seeker head, brought the Navy into battles and campaigns far from where the Navy ships were patrolling in international waters. And for the Air Force, the Gulf War demonstrated how precision-guided munitions like GPS-guided bombs and cruise missiles, as well as networks of sensors, could enable manned platforms to execute core ideas about strategic air power, first advocated by people like John Warden or Dave Deptula. With major advancements in radars, avionics suites, and stealth, the pilot was moved further away from the battlefield, but not necessarily further away from the platform. As a side note, I think it's important to point out that while the Air Force launched 35 cruise missiles called the Calcums from the B-52 to start the Gulf War, these were never the preferred munition of the Air Force. And in fact, the Air Force's story with cruise missiles was more a response to the Navy's success with the Tomahawk than any Air Force-initiated effort. After dragging their heels on developing cruise missiles during the Carter administration, Congress and the President threatened to make them adopt the Navy's Tomahawk program. That put a fire under the Air Force's cruise missile program. As one Air Force general officer recounted, they realized they had better get behind the cruise missile or they would get a torpedo rammed up their bomb bay. The Gulf War also solidified the importance of space. After Eisenhower had put most of the space missions in the civilian National Reconnaissance Office, he had left the Navy in charge of navigation satellites, the Army in charge of communication, and the Air Force the lead on nuclear early warning. This rather arbitrary division of responsibility within space decreased service fights over space, but it also led to a lower priority in service budgets, especially when the resources served joint purposes. So, for example, investments in global positioning systems stalled in the 1980s as the services focused instead on big-ticket platforms within their budgets. It was not until the Gulf War that the Air Force doubled down on GPS investments. But Let's be honest, this was after the Air Force had tried multiple times to cut the GPS program. The Marines, an Iraqi unit, even surrendered to a Pioneer UAV, the first known surrender of a manned unit to an unmanned platform. Here's Marine
Corps under Al Gray in the 80s in Lebanon, really leaning into some pretty interesting uses of unmanned systems. In fact, they started to use them pretty successfully in the Gulf War, too. We don't talk enough about that in kind of the history.
As the U.S. took its Desert Storm victory lap, the RMA and military revolutions looked poised to define the post-Cold War American military. But it was a short victory that failed the RMA. First, in Somalia, a Black Hawk helicopter with its American Army pilot and crew were shot down by militant rebels, an event that played out on the screens of an international audience. 18 Americans dead, 73 wounded, and the bodies of the deceased American soldiers dragged through the streets of Mogadishu.
CW3, Mike Durant.
An American helicopter pilot taken prisoner in Somalia. Dazed and bloodied, he is questioned by his captors.
Innocent people being killed is not good.
One of 6 U.S. soldiers listed as missing in the heaviest fighting yet in Mogadishu. 12 American soldiers killed.
A few years later, a fighter pilot named Scott O'Grady was shot down over Bosnia, sparking an embarrassingly public manhunt for the downed pilot.
6 days after he was shot down, O'Grady was rescued near Bihać, Bosnia.
We're taught you need to look for a will to survive. Really came through my faith in God and wanting to go back to what I treasure the most in life, and that's my family.
The message after these 2 very public events was clear. Why put American military members at risk if we could use unmanned technology instead? Military revolutions were about how the information revolution could create wars of speed, decision advantage, range, and precision. But the lesson of the conflicts America opted into during the 1990s was not about how technology created wars of technological maneuver, but instead how they could be used to minimize political risk by optimizing range and persistence to minimize any potential political risk to decision makers. This is why, instead of investments in unmanned technology that linked unmanned and manned systems together to harness military revolutions, what we mostly got was a decade of long-range, low-risk, sometimes effective, cruise missile strikes.
The cruise missile punishes dramatically. Not so dramatically as manned fighters or bombers, but its big advantage is it doesn't put U.S. lives on the line because it's fired unmanned from hundreds of miles away.
Like the cruise missiles that struck Sudan and Afghanistan.
Good afternoon. Today, I ordered our armed forces to strike at terrorist-related facilities in Afghanistan and Sudan because of the threat they present to our national security.
And then Iraq.
Earlier today, I ordered American forces to strike Iraq. Our missiles sent the following message to Saddam Hussein. When you abuse your own people or threaten your neighbors, you must pay a price.
And then Bosnia.
No deployment of American troops is risk-free, and this one may well involve casualties. There may be accidents in the field or incidents with people who have not given up their hatred. I will take every measure possible to minimize these risks, but we must be prepared for that possibility.
The Clinton years were tough for RMA, Andy Marshall, and the Office of Net Assessment. Whereas Marshall had significant influence with the first Bush's outgoing Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, his relationship with Cheney's successor, Les Aspin, and Aspin's head of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Policy Planning Staff, Clark Murdoch, was less constructive. As Krapinovich and Watts recount of a meeting between Murdoch and Marshall, Murdoch wasn't convinced that military revolutions appealed to the service chiefs, who weren't worried about any major challenge to U.S. military dominance arising anytime soon, and that the military revolution assessment wasn't going to help diddly, well, poo-poo, in Bosnia or Somalia. And that's what people care about now. The MTR didn't do a god-something thing for Marines and Somalia. We've censored some of the language, but you get the point. The cruise missile may have been the preferred weapon of the Clinton administration, but it wasn't the only unmanned system in the arsenal during these force protection years. The Army and the Marines had invested in unmanned aerial systems that they had used in the Gulf War to support the ground units with persistent aerial reconnaissance. At first, the Air Force wasn't interested. However, the Army started to get serious about these systems, and the Joint Defense Airborne Reconnaissance Office threatened to consolidate these unmanned systems in the Joint, or worse for the Air Force, the Army sphere of influence. Similar to the embrace of missiles after World War II, the Air Force saw a threat to its dominance and needed to make a dramatic move to capture the UAV mission. In 1996, Air Force Chief of Staff Fogelman declared that on my watch, the Air Force will embrace UAVs and work to fully exploit their potential. Fogelman made the institutional move to take over the UAV program, grabbing both the long-range Global Hawk and the medium-altitude Predator into the Air Force's control. To overcome within Air Force resistance to these programs, Fogelman explained to Air Force generals that the Marines and Army were hot on the heels of this new and threatened to hijack the trajectory of these systems. Faced with sister service competition that threatened the Air Force's core service identity, Air Force generals began to jump on the UAV train. Fogelman was a pivotal character in the Air Force's unmanned journey, in large part because his experiences, first in Vietnam and later with the shoot-down of Captain Scott O'Grady, shaped his vision of unmanned systems for the Air Force. In 1994, Fogelman commissioned a group of academics and strategic thinkers to run a Defense Science Board study on the future of the Air Force. Entitled New World Vistas, its authors argued that current unmanned aircraft have limited capabilities, serving either as cruise missiles or as relatively expendable reconnaissance probes. Instead of these uses, which was primarily how the Army viewed unmanned systems, the authors proposed a new Air Force version of unmanned systems, explaining that new information technologies are likely to soon allow the creation of uninhabited combat aerial vehicles flown by pilots who never leave the ground. With the election of George W. Bush in 2000 and the appointment of Office of Net Assessment old hand Jim Roche, Fogelman had an ally at the top of the civilian leadership within the Air Force. Here's former Air Force Secretary Jim Roche describing the early testing of the Predator MQ-1 drone with the Hellfire missile.
We took the plane and did a bunch of tests and found that if we got together with the Army, they would give us a very nice weapon, Hellfire. And the only problem we had was, we had two problems. One, Hellfires are normally on helicopters who are in develop and low. So when you first fire Hellfire, it goes up. If you're Predator, you don't want it to go up. You want it to go down. But the Army was wonderful. And Huntsville, in Alabama, they changed the software to make them go down. Took care of that problem. The second thing we found, what Tom said was, we would hit a building, they would go inside, blow up, people will walk out. And he said, why are they walking out? And I said, it's a good question, boss. I said, leave it alone, I'll do it. And it turns out it was an explosion. They would get these thick walls, but once inside, they just blew up and pressure. Very few people were injured. So we said, okay, Army, you're smarter than we are on these things. What would you do to make Hellfire solve our problem? In 1 week, they devised a shroud to go over the weapon head that flashed into 1,000 razor blades. Now, 1,000 razor blades have shown up in other things too, but these work. Once they got inside the building, it blew up. Not very many people walked out. So we're starting right off with the Army.
Despite the early innovation, Roche was still meeting with a lot of resistance from within the other services as they tried to transition the MQ-1 from reconnaissance to strike.
We could not get the Air Force or the Navy pilots to accept remotely piloted aircraft that blew up things. Because that's where you had manned airplanes. Mm-hmm. And we kept saying, look, we've got to change. We've got to do this other thing. No. Anything you do with that, I think we could do better with an airplane.
All that resistance would change just a few months later when the Twin Towers fell and the George W. Bush administration, just a year into its tenure, found itself at war. 2 decades of counterinsurgency wars would be military revolution's biggest challenge yet. A distraction so powerful it would take a new, third offset to resurrect the old ideas. And when we started recording this podcast, we planned to highlight the remarkable resilience of the Office of Net Assessment and their ideas about the future of war, something you'll hear more about next episode. But things have changed. A few years ago, Andy Marshall passed, but the office continued on under the leadership of Andrew May and Jim Baker. That was until March 2025, when Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth disbanded the Office of Net Assessment. After surviving decades of presidents, SecDefs, the Cold War, Moot Waz, and the global war on terror, the unremarkable office in the depths of the Pentagon no longer contributes remarkable ideas about technology and the American way of war. So who will be the weapons influencers of tomorrow? Join us in the next episode of The Hand Behind Unmanned, where an attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon hijacked the trajectory of a post-Cold War American military and create a world primed for wars of unmanned persistence, led by the MQ-1 Predator and a later MQ-9 Reaper. I leave you with a final few words from Andrew Krapinovich about the lasting legacy of the Office of Net Assessment.
Marshall was very keen on saying net assessment's about the diagnosis. He said, we're not here to provide a prescription. I think that's one of the reasons why the office lasted so long. It has lasted so long. He didn't go into the defense secretary and say, well, you need 114 F-22s and 386 F-35s. He would go in and say, these are some key trends in the competition. Here's areas where it looks like we have some wasting assets. Here's some new opportunities. If we're looking at an offsetting adversary advantages, here's some potential offsetting strategies, IT, for example. Here are some cost-imposing strategies we might pursue.
I'm Julia.
And I'm Jackie.
This is the Hand Behind Unmanned podcast. If you liked it, buy the book. It's by Oxford University Press and available on Amazon.
Thanks for listening.
Episode 5, War Against Terror, The Predator Age.
Former Secretary Rumsfeld said, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had. And people made fun of him when he said that, and I could never quite understand that. Because in fact, what he was saying was a central challenge of the military profession, which is that militaries in peacetime place bets against an uncertain future. And it's only when war comes that you find out whether those have been good bets or colossally bad bets. And what are the two things that you can use to place bets? Well, one is history, right? Particularly your own, received history. And then the other is theory. It's ideas. Because aside from theory and aside from history, got nothing to go on.
Welcome to The Hand Behind Unmanned, a podcast about how America fights war without human beings, told from the perspective of the human beings making those choices. I'm Jackie Schneider.
And I'm Julia McDonald. In this podcast, we take you inside weapons budget lines and behind classified program doors to understand not only what unmanned technology the U.S. military bought, but why. For those of you who came for the technology, we hope you'll stay for the people, because this really is a story about remarkable humans, historical junctures, and our beliefs about the future of war and what that means for unmanned weapons we buy.
Along the way in our unmanned journey, we'll learn valuable lessons about how technology shapes the winners and losers in war, how humans and technology interact at a time when the march of technological progress seems inevitable, how public funds get invested when it comes to warfare, and above all, the human hands at the heart of unmanned technology. Last episode, we covered the end of the Cold War and into the early 1990s, where the swift victory in the Gulf War showcased a new generation of cruise missiles and precision-guided munitions that could enable the U.S. to fight wars of choice without risking human life. We also heard how conflicts in Somalia and Bosnia served to sideline the military revolution advocates, like Andy Marshall, in favor of investments in technologies like cruise missiles that could minimize political risk. But by 2000, the deck chairs had changed again, with the election of George W. Bush in 2000 and the appointment of the Office of Net Assessment old hand Jim Roche as Secretary of the Air Force. The time was right for military revolutions to finally fulfill its vision. This all changed on September 11th, 2001.
This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. The CNN Center right now is just beginning to work on this story, obviously calling our sources and trying to figure out exactly what happened, but clearly something relatively devastating happening this morning there.
Suddenly, the United States was at war again and needed defense budgets and weapons to fight that war. And it was a very different kind of war than those who had advocated for military revolutions had envisaged. September 11 was a critical juncture in the proliferation of unmanned technologies. It shifted the focus from cruise missiles and long-range strike to loitering, remote-controlled unmanned systems with high-precision smart munitions, and cemented that dominance with a huge increase in military budgets. The global war on terror, and a previous decade of economic growth, brought with it the largest increase in defense spending since the Cold War. American leaders, previously focused on high-tech transformation of the U.S. military to combat a rising China, needed new options to wage war against a low-tech Taliban in remote and mountainous Pakistan and Afghanistan.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
Luckily, the military had an option. While the Predator debuted in the 1990s, providing overhead coverage in Bosnia and Kosovo, it cemented its breakout role in modern conflict after 9/11. Leading up to 9/11, the Predator was a niche project funded almost completely out of hide by a small defense industrial base company that believed in the revolutionary role of these unmanned technologies. But after 9/11, the Predator moved out of its fringe role and vaulted into one of the most iconic weapons platforms of the global war on terror. For years, U.S. leaders like Air Force Chief of Staff Fogelman had played with the idea of arming the Predator, but there had been resistance within the services. 9/11 changed everything. In the hunt for a platform that could fly in politically fraught airspace for long periods of time, there was now a clear imperative to arm what had been a reconnaissance-only unmanned system, thereby introducing to the battlefield one of the first armed unmanned platforms. As then Secretary of the Air Force James Roche recounted in the last episode, there was a lot of resistance to arming the Predator before 9/11, but then 2 buildings fell over, and suddenly arming the Predator didn't seem nearly as risky or revolutionary as it had previously. The Predator, armed with Hellfire missiles, enabled warfare that was precise, limited, and persistent. The Hellfire, originally an anti-tank helicopter-fired missile, was initially part of a suite of precision-guided munitions spurred by former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry's second offset. Accordingly, the first few iterations of the missile focused on destroying Soviet tank masses, and subsequent modifications focused on firepower and warhead improvements. By the early 2000s, its laser guidance had been adapted to a fire-and-forget system, making it ideal for the unmanned Predator. As Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense and Director of the CIA, explains.
And so, because of 9/11, we clearly made the decision we were going to go to war against those who were responsible for the attack on 9/11.
And we did. Obviously went into Afghanistan, etc. But those that were principally involved with that plot disappeared into the tribal areas of Pakistan. And when the United States tried to use either fighter planes or boots on the ground, Pakistan objected to that. And so in many ways, our hands were tied. And then President Bush, along with Mike Hayden, made a decision to try to use drones as a weapon to go after those individuals. But by the time I arrived as secretary or as director of CIA, we had developed a very sophisticated operation.
The Predator and then its replacement, the Reaper, became an integral part of campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a selling point by Department of Defense leaders to Congress as they advocated for continued support in the wars. As Secretary Rumsfeld told Congress, unmanned surveillance and attack aircraft like Global Hawk and Predator offered a glimpse of their potential in Afghanistan. The 2003 budget increases the number of unmanned aircraft being procured and accelerates the development of new unmanned combat aerial vehicles capable of striking targets in denied areas without putting pilots at risk. On the success of these platforms, Secretary Panetta adds,
and using the drone capability, we were able to do a tremendous amount of surveillance. We were able to sight some of the targets. And obviously, with the drone capabilities, we were able to actually hit those targets. And I would say, looking back on it, that because the reason we were successful at winning this war on terrorism and going after Al-Qaeda to develop other plans and other attacks, I think because of the drones, we were able to destroy that capability. So I think history will look back on that period and really use it as an example of how effective drones can be in confronting our enemies.
The remotely piloted aircraft provided two new capabilities to the U.S. military, which became key to counterinsurgency operations. First, these systems could loiter over targets for long periods of time. Equipped with full-motion video and near real-time data transfer, tactical units, ground commanders, and campaign leaders could watch the battlefield and targets almost constantly. Second, these remotely piloted systems kept pilots out of risk and increased the distance between the shooter and danger, thus decreasing the chance for another Somalia Black Hawk Down event. As former Chief of Staff Norman Schwartz argued, in my mind, the remotely piloted aircraft, or RPA, is the single most significant advance since radar. This goes back centuries to the bow and arrow. The spear artillery aircraft, there's been a momentum to extend the distance between combatants from the very earliest days. The difference is that now we have the ability to fly lethal aircraft without the risk of physical danger to the pilot. It's monumental. The United States had come to a fork in the road for unmanned systems and weapon investments for the information revolution, and the U.S. military decided to plunge headlong into tactical reconnaissance unmanned systems that were remotely controlled and persistent. In past episodes, we introduced two dominant beliefs in the evolution: casualty aversion and force protection on the one hand, and beliefs in military in Iraq and Afghanistan significantly shifted the trajectory of unmanned systems and created the impetus for a noteworthy evolution of beliefs in casualty that despite the United States' desire for short and overwhelming wars, it would be difficult to win quickly, decisively, or with a light tech-enabled footprint in either Iraq or Afghanistan. Decision-makers needed to update their beliefs about technology and casualty aversion. With the United States once again in a war of attrition against an insurgency, the idea of using unmanned technology to protect U.S. boots on the ground returned to vogue. The new generation of casualty aversion beliefs was far more sophisticated, both in its beliefs about the ability to completely reduce the risk of casualties to U.S. personnel, and in the ability of technology to decrease that risk. Unmanned aerial vehicles substituted for risk by removing manned pilots. However, over time, and as it became increasingly clear there were not significant threats to manned aircraft, the motivation behind the systems became less about substituting for human risk individually, and instead about using unmanned sensors to decrease the chance of loss of life across the conflict. This was important. Counterinsurgency operations required the military not only to protect its own forces from needless casualties, but also to win the hearts and minds of the wider population. On reducing civilian casualties, here is Peter Fever, Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at Duke University.
First, let me talk about one other trade-off that matters, which is, up until now, I've been talking about the trade-off between our casualties and success. But there's another trade-off that's involved, our casualties and their casualties, or particularly their civilian casualties. And there the picture is much more murky. The laws of war say that we have to incur greater risk of our combat casualties to reduce the risk of their civilian casualties. And the public views on that is mixed. Policymakers over the last 80 years have become more and more attuned to this and the need to reduce civilian casualties as well. And again, the contrast with the battles, the firebombing of Tokyo, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, huge numbers of civilian casualties that were inflicted so as to save U.S. combat casualties. That trade-off, policymakers today, or up until the Trump administration at least, American policymakers said, we're not going to do that anymore. So we are going to reduce our own combat casualties and we're going to reduce their civilian casualties. And that's required much greater precision in fires and in targeting.
Unmanned aerial vehicles, precise and small effect missiles, and improvements to laser and global positioning system-guided bombs all help decrease civilian casualties and risk to U.S. and allied forces. They also provided situational awareness required to enforce tight rules of engagement. Investments in space-based communications and navigation allowed for centralization and remote control of unmanned systems, while unmanned aerial vehicles and space intelligence assets, previously used for strategic intelligence, were pivoted to tactical collection. Meanwhile, on defense, the United States invested in unmanned ground vehicles to detonate IEDs and automated counter-mortar systems like the CRAM to shoot down incoming mortar salvos. This new coin strategy substituted swift and overwhelming campaigns for a new theory of persistence enabled by technology, both on the battlefield for tactical victory and strategically ensuring up public support to ensure the nation's staying power within a campaign. In a way, after the failure of Rumsfeld's transformation initiatives to create quick wins in Afghanistan or Iraq, the U.S. military had returned to an updated theory of attrition in which the United States would win, not by creating more enemy body bags, but instead by winning a war of the attrition of political will. This was a better version of Westmoreland's invisible fence. It was smarter, more integrated, more persistent, and more controlled than Westmoreland's failed unmanned experiment in Vietnam. The intention was the same. However, the technological advances in those 3 decades allowed U.S. decision-makers to adapt unmanned systems to attempt to win a war of attrition while maintaining public support. This led to unmanned systems that were expensive, required significant logistical support, and sacrificed firepower for control and precision. Remote-controlled strike-capable unmanned aerial vehicles were perfectly suited to this kind of war. This was a new twist on unmanned systems, strictly for force protection. Instead of focusing on protecting friendly lives on the battlefield, they were also insulating decision-makers from international political ill will, providing a means of persistence in the face of international criticism. So what happened to the military revolution advocates during this period? While the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq ushered in huge changes in unmanned systems, in particular the dominance of remotely controlled unmanned aerial systems, and galvanized support and investment in these systems, but it was never what the original military revolution thinkers had envisaged. While the military revolutionists continued to push for transformation within the Department of Defense, and many of Marshall's original group played prominent roles in the Bush administration, the ideas espoused in the Quadrennial Defense Review from 2001 were more often derailed than catalyzed by the realities of fighting and funding 2 wars in the Middle East. Though there was a significant increase in weapons investments during the global war on terror, not all systems were getting a push from it. Many of the systems envisaged by military revolutions believers struggled to survive the acquisition's valley of death. As Peter Dombrowski and Andrew Ross recount in their analysis of transformation and defense industrial base outliers during the Bush administration, what was labeled the Long War, roughly the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq, plus an alleged global war on terror, affected both the pace and extent of transformation. Military spending increased rapidly, and the Afghan and Iraq campaigns further tested, on a much grander scale, weapons and systems that first appeared within the Persian Gulf War and in the Balkans during the 1990s. Broad-based transformation goals may have suffered as the operational challenges of ongoing campaigns served to focus research and development resources on technologies and systems barely on the radar screen of early transformation advocates. Perhaps the greatest example of the way in which 9/11 and the global war on terror affected the weapons and unmanned systems trajectory was the Army's Future Command System, or FCS. The FCS was perhaps the most ideal pursuit of the kind of weapons optimized for an IT revolution. It included an integrated system of communications, network capabilities, sensors, manned and unmanned systems, and smart munitions. The new force structure called for lighter, more mobile, manned, unmanned, and robotic vehicles designed to track and outmaneuver enemies through effective information sharing. The final FCS included proposals for UAVs, as well as small unmanned ground vehicles, intelligent munitions, and unmanned ground sensors. But the program ultimately failed. Its system of systems design called for the most difficult and complex set of requirements the Army had ever worked with, and a firmly entrenched Army service culture focused not on how all these things linked together or the use of unmanned systems, but instead on the development of new manned ground vehicles. When the threats to Army vehicles changed, namely the prominence of IEDs in Operation Iraqi Freedom, the amount of unmanned systems and sensors required to support the lightly armored manned vehicles made the concept tactically moot. Finally, the focus on manned vehicles over the network systems required to link all the elements of the FCS made unmanned systems largely unusable, as they, unlike the manned components, needed networks to function. Here's military innovation scholar Ben Jensen on the failure of the FCS.
You have this vision how the Army sees itself evolving. The challenge they ran into, though, is not just the normal, it's hard to... It was actually about bandwidth and secure communications. So one of the limiting factors to some of the autonomy push for the Army at that time was actually that. It was they were really struggling to figure out how to have a large enough bandwidth and the right amount of latency to have these, encrypted digital battle networks at the size of space a brigade would imagine fighting. And you can see this all in these, ridiulous FCS videos. I want to say it was Boeing and SAIC produced FCS videos. I want to say it was Boeing and SAIC produced, where it felt just like a bad episode of that old Jack Bauer show. It had that same feel of a post 9/11 drama, but all of a sudden they had fictional characters like me and Swarovski are deployed and we're going to fight it out. And they've got hovering drones that are fantastic. None of that stuff came, though, because, again, the Army found itself once again, just like Vietnam, all that modernization money dries up when you're begging Congress for what's called OCOCO, Overseas Contingency Operation Funds, because you're doing these kind of counterinsurgencies and strange forms of stability ops and CT around the world. So that FCS vision had both a technical limitation, but then it also had a funding limitation with the realities of protracted conflict.
It wasn't just the services keen on pet platforms or the defense industrial base ill-equipped for the ITRMA that derailed the trajectory for unmanned systems envisaged by the military revolution. It was also a push from the very top. Coming into the Secretary of Defense position in 2006 after 5 years of failed transformation efforts and knee-deep in the Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns, Robert Gates had no patience either for service pet projects or future technology investments over what the warfighters needed or wanted at that moment. And what the warfighters wanted was more predators and reapers to fight two hot wars happening right now, not high-tech systems of autonomous long-range strike munitions. In fact, Robert Gates once referred to next war-itis, arguing that we must not be so preoccupied with preparing for future conventional and strategic conflicts that we neglect to provide both short-term and long-term all the capabilities necessary to fight and win conflicts such as we are in today. The Air Force, having captured the UAV mission in the mid-1990s, was now struggling to find its place in a coin-dominated world that relied increasingly on remotely piloted aircraft, a sharp departure from the theories of strategic air power that had dominated at the turn of the century. This is Jack Shanahan, a retired U.S. Air Force three-star general who stood up Project Maven and the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center in the Pentagon.
So, of course, you know that the Air Force had been moving along somewhat slowly with the beginnings of Predator back in the days, and Osama bin Laden, and that strike that could have happened but didn't happen. A guy named Snake Clark in the Air Force has a whole story about how the drones came about. And Snake's pretty creative and interesting sort of storyteller, but I think a lot of it, he actually had it right, is that it was sort of slow at first. There was a reluctance to do that, but some of it was a reluctance just because the technology was not ready yet. But once you had this pressure from above, I mean, nobody put as much pressure on than Secretary Gates. I was there as a one-star when there was just everyday pressure to put more and more. They called them combat air patrols, CAPs, but it was really orbits, more Predators and Reapers up in the skies over Afghanistan and Iraq. You know, at one point, I think we ended up with 65 simultaneous orbits that were going on. Enormous pressure.
To accommodate this push from the top and the reality of the wars in the Middle East, the Air Force successed our mission, but not at the expense of its core manned mission. Jack Shanahan continues.
So the Air Force is known as the ISR service. It's known as a very technically savvy force. So I think there was an understanding and almost an embracing of, we'll get this ISR thing right as long as we do not jeopardize this manned pilot world of F-16, F-15, fighter pilots, all that whole community. As long as you don't come at the expense of the rest of the manned community, we're okay with this and we're going to be on board. Still, they were dragged along a little bit of screaming about standing up this really became a very big enterprise of ISR in the former Predator Reapers, Creech Air Force Base.
One individual in particular, General Michael Mosley, Robert Gates' chief of staff, was especially vocal in fighting for the Air Force's core manned missions and in continuing to promote the F-22s and F-35s the Air Force had been developing for strategic attack against a peer competitor. But Gates was tired of facing cultural impediments to his mission of expanding the inventory of UAVs. He dismissed Mosley and replaced him with Norman Schwartz, a special operations command pilot who was a big believer in unmanned systems designed to support ground conflict. Schwartz led a push for unmanned units and personnel from the top and appointed generals who supported his vision for the systems. Shanahan again on Gates's push from the top.
But the other pressure, of course, at the time was Secretary Gates telling in a not so polite way to the Secretary of the Air Force and Chief of Staff of the Air Force, shut up in color on the F-22. You're not getting any more of those. And by the way, you've got other systemic problems you need to fix in your nuclear industry and all these other pieces of it. And so it was, you're going to get this right. And that's really what drove the ISR portion of this, which is really what most of this is. It's ISR/strike. The line is extremely blurred, if disappeared. One day it's ISR, the next day it's strike, and then 2 hours later you're back and going in the other direction. There is a big cultural component to this, and there is no question. There was resistance and reluctance to go down this path too far, but there was also no choice that they had to get on board because people were dying in combat. That was the big difference. Secretary Gates was just had no patience for anybody that was not going to sign up to give more to the fight in the Middle East.
And the U.S. Air Force ultimately adapted to accommodate this change, adeptly linking military revolutions and force protection beliefs to argue that technology that distanced the human from the battlefield would not only create effectiveness, but also decrease casualties in war. On the importance of the UAV pilots, Secretary Panetta adds,
even though, the Air Force, obviously these guys love to fly their planes and to be pilots, with time, they recognized, and I told them this when I spoke to a group of these pilots, I said, I realized, this doesn't have a lot of the glory associated with being a fighter pilot. But I have to tell you, you are helping us accomplish a very important mission of going after those who would threaten our country. And you do it successfully. And you really deserve a lot of credit for that. I actually, as secretary, decided that it was important for those that were really operating above and beyond the call of duty to even provide an award to those that were involved in piloting, because I thought it was important to recognize their service to the country.
Moving into the second half of the Obama administration, a push from above from Gates, a glut of spending on 2 campaigns against insurgents and terrorists in the Middle East, and wartime experimentation transitioned remotely piloted aircraft into the dominant unmanned system for both research and procurement in the U.S. military. And U.S. leaders during his time in office.
Dozens of highly skilled al-Qaeda commanders, trainers, bomb makers, and operatives have been taken off the battlefield, and our troops in Afghanistan. Simply put, these strikes have saved lives.
But the focus was not on using unmanned systems as part of a system of systems to combat peer competitors, but instead on mitigating risk to U.S. military personnel and creating persistent and remotely controlled surveillance. But the belief in military revolutions wasn't dead. Andy Marshall's influence was now embedded within the ranks of the military and resurrection with a remarkable policy entrepreneur, Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, a former participant in Andy Marshall's 2020 Games who had served for 27 years in the Marines. Bob Work's main contribution during this period is known as the guided munitions regime in the 1970s. In the first, the United States leveraged its technical advantage in nuclear weapons